His hands were bound in iron, heavy old iron that had rubbed his wrists raw. He tried to take a deeper breath, and his ribs responded with such pain that he nearly lost consciousness again. Somewhere above, wood creaked. The steady splash of water pounded against the hull. The ship was rocking. He was on a ship. Dan opened his eyes and saw a dark, low ceiling made of blackened beams. The hold. He was lying in the ship's hold, shackled, and didn't understand a thing. The last thing he remembered was the headlights of an oncoming truck and the sound of the crash that made the world collapse like a paper cup. He'd been driving home from the night shift. He'd fallen asleep at the wheel. He'd died. He was definitely dead. But the dead don't feel iron cutting into their skin. The dead don't hear the creak of the mast overhead. Dan raised his hands and looked at them. They were someone else's hands. Thin, pale fingers without a single callus from hard labor. These weren't the hands of a man who'd spent 10 years standing by the catalytic cracking unit at a plant in Houston. These were someone else's hands. He felt his face. His cheekbones were sharper. His jaw was narrower. His hair was longer and wet. A stranger's body. A stranger's face. A stranger's hands. But his mind was his own. His memory was his own. He remembered the formulas. He remembered the smell of gasoline fractions. He remembered his shift supervisor's name and which report on the distillation column he hadn't finished writing before getting into the car. All of that was his. But the body wasn't. A hatch opened above and light flooded his eyes. A rough voice shouted for everyone to come up. Dan tried to stand and realized his legs could barely hold him up. His body was weak and emaciated. Someone grabbed him by the shoulder and dragged him toward the stairs. Others were climbing up beside him, men in the same shackles. Skinny, ragged figures with empty expressions. People who had long since stopped hoping for anything good. There were 11 of them, not counting himself. 12 people in shackles on the deck of an imperial galley under the grey dawn sky. Dan squinted against the light and tried to piece together everything he knew. Fragments of someone else's memory surfaced on their own. Long corridors with tall windows, whispers behind doors, the smell of ink and sealing wax, the face of a woman with cold, light eyes who smiled as she signed the paper. That signature was a death sentence.
The name came to him on its own. Daniel Crow, junior advisor to the treasury of the Valestine Empire, convicted of treason. Sentence? Life exile to the island of Crescent. Dan didn't know what the Valestine Empire was. He didn't know what the island of Crescent was, but he felt the terror that name evoked in the former master of his body. A deep, animalistic terror sewn directly into his muscle memory. One of the soldiers on deck nodded toward the shore and told another that in an hour they'd dump these dogs on the cursed island and head back. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were throwing out trash. Dan turned his head and looked at the shore, and everything changed. The shore was black. Not dark like wet rocks, but actually black. A thick, oily blackness covered the rocks and trickled down toward the water, leaving an iridescent film on the surface. The wind carried a smell from there. Dan drew in a breath through his nose and froze. Hydrogen sulfide. Light hydrocarbon fractions. Bitumen in the sun. He knew that smell better than the smell of his own home. 10 years at an oil refinery. 10 years surrounded by that smell, 12 hours a shift. It was oil. Crude oil seeping directly to the surface from cracks in the bedrock. Dan looked at the iridescent film on the water. He looked at the black streaks on the rocks. He looked at the shiny streaks of congealed bitumen on the stones right at the water's edge. His mind was already working on autopilot. Judging by the color, it's light or medium crude. high yield of gasoline and kerosene fractions. The sulfur smell is faint, which means distillation will be easier. The seepage to the surface was abundant, which meant the reservoir wasn't deep and the pressure was good. It was an oil field. An open, rich oil field that no one in the world had ever thought to reach because everyone considered the black sludge a curse of demons. A soldier kicked him in the back and shouted that there was no time to stand around. It was time to get moving toward the ladders. Dan walked on, and for the first time since he'd woken up, he smiled. Not a broad smile, not a joyful one. Quiet and stern, like a man who had just realized he'd been dealt trump cards the dealer didn't even suspect he had. He'd been exiled to die at an undeveloped, unclaimed and untaxed oil field. The gangplanks struck the rocks. Soldiers lined up along the sides and began shoving the exiles overboard.
The first to fall onto the rocks was a large man in his 50s, with a weather-beaten face and the hands of a fisherman. He struggled to his feet, spat out blood, and looked toward the shore with the eyes of a man who had just been buried alive. Second came a young man with a shaved head and a scar running across his cheek, a deserter, judging by the fragments of someone else's memory. Third was a woman, thin and pale, with short dark hair and a calm face that expressed absolutely nothing. She descended the ramp as if walking down the stairs of a palace, steadily, without haste. Dan remembered her. Something in someone else's memory twitched at the sight of this woman, but the fragment slipped away. The rest came down one by one. A gaunt old man with sunken cheeks. Two brothers, as alike as reflections, with identical broken noses. A man in the tatters of once expensive clothing, with the face of an impoverished nobleman. A sturdy, closely cropped man who moved with too much composure for a mere prisoner. Three more whom Dan didn't have time to get a good look at. And last of all, he himself came down. The stones beneath his feet were slippery from the oil film. Dan took a step and nearly fell. His body felt weak and unfamiliar. His legs were thinner than he was used to. His center of gravity was different. He stayed on his feet only because he grabbed the edge of the ramp with both his shackled hands. A soldier above threw a sack onto the rocks. Then a second, then a third. 3 sacks of rations for 12 men. A bungle fell nearby, spilling out a single axe and 2 knives. That was all. The galley captain leaned over the rail and said the provisions would last 3 weeks if they didn't eat like pigs. He said the next ship wouldn't be coming anytime soon. He didn't specify when, because the next ship would never come. Everyone understood this. The gangplanks were pulled back in. The galley began to turn away. 12 men stood on the black shore of the cursed island and watched the ship sail away. No one shouted. No one begged to be taken back. They all knew this was the end. Everyone except Dan. He stood there, looking not at the ship, but at the ground beneath their feet. At the shiny black streaks between the rocks, at the puddle of crude oil 10 paces from the shore, at the dark spots on the cliffs stretching up the slope. He estimated the area of the outcrop. He estimated the viscosity by the way the sludge trickled down the rock. He estimated the temperature of the spill by its smell. A fisherman with a weather-beaten face, the very same burly man who had fallen first, approached him and said there was no point in staring at that filth and that they needed to set up a shelter before dark. His name was Hank Albray. Dan nodded. He looked at Hank and said he was right and that setting up the shelter was the first priority. But to himself, he was thinking about something else. He was thinking that from this puddle of crude oil, through the simplest distillation, one could obtain kerosene, ligroin, fuel oil, bitumen, and paraffin. He was thinking that 1 liter of kerosene burns 6 times longer and brighter than the same amount of whale blubber. He thought about how, in an empire that waged war with sailing ships, a man with a steam engine was not an engineer, but a god. But first, he had to survive until tomorrow.
The first day passed in mindless, grueling labor. 12 men in shackles tried to build at least some sort of kind of shelter on the shore of an island that reeked of sulfur and death. Hank turned out to be the only one who really knew how to work with his hands. He grabbed an axe and began chopping down the gnarled trees growing a little higher up the slope. The trees were spindly and damp. The firewood they made burned poorly. Dan silently watched the men, trying to figure out who he was dealing with. Hank the fisherman, reliable, stubborn, and used to hard labor. The deserter with the scar, silent, angry but strong. 2 brothers with broken noses. Thieves, most likely, both nimble and quick. An impoverished nobleman in a tattered doublet, physically useless but literate. A skinny old man. A former priest, judging by the way he muttered prayers with every gust of wind. A man with a crew cut and measured movements. Dan couldn't figure this one out, and it was getting on his nerves. And a woman. Pale, calm, with a blank expression. She wasn't helping with the hideout. She sat on a rock and stared out at the sea. No one bothered her. Dan had so far classified the other 3 as part of the grey masses. 2 former peasants convicted of poaching, and a low-level official who had embezzled money while collecting taxes. By evening, they had built something resembling a shelter. Crooked poles, damp branches, and a piece of canvas that one of the brothers had snatched from a truck when no one was looking. The wind was blowing from all directions. The temperature was dropping.
Hank tried to start a fire with damp wood. The wood smoked, gave off fumes, and refused to burn properly. The fire was weak and pitiful.
12 men sat around the dying fire in silence. Hank said they wouldn't make it until morning. He said it calmly, like a man who had already made up his mind and was simply stating a fact. Dan stood up. He said he needed a pot or any kind of container. One of the brothers handed him a clay pot from his ration bag. Dan took the pot and walked off into the darkness. The others watched him go. He returned 5 minutes later. The pot was full of thick, black sludge. Dan set it down next to the campfire. He tore a strip from his shirt, dipped it into the sludge. He lit it from a smouldering branch and tossed it back into the pot. The black sludge flared up. A steady, strong, hot flame rose above the pot with almost no smoke. The fire was so hot that the deserter sitting closest to it recoiled. 12 men silently watched the steady golden flame burning from what they all considered cursed poison. Hank raised his head and looked at Dan. He asked what it was. Dan sat back down by the fire and held his hands out toward the warmth. He said it was combustible oil. He said it burns for a long time and with intense heat. He said there was enough of this oil on the island to last 1,000 years. Then he fell silent for a second. Then he said one more thing. He said that beneath their feet lay a treasure for which empires would slit each other's throats. The only question was whether they would manage to become more indispensable before the empire even remembered they were here at all. No one answered. But that night, all 12 slept in warmth for the first time since their arrest. The morning of the second day began with a scream. One of the brothers, the younger one, clutched his stomach and collapsed onto the rocks. He was vomiting black water. He had drunk from the stream that ran between the rocks further down the shore. Dan walked over and looked at the stream. The water was slightly murky, with a thin, oily film on the surface. Oil was seeping into the groundwater and poisoning everything that flowed from this side of the island. Dan crouched down and explained to Hank that they couldn't drink that water. Hank asked, "Then what can we drink?" Dan said they needed to look for a spring higher up the slope on the other side of the oil seeps. The rock there should be cleaner, and so should the water.
They sent the deserter and one of the peasants to scout up the slope. One brother lay there moaning. The other brother sat beside him, silently stroking his head. The former priest muttered a prayer. Dan turned with what was most important at that moment: food.
The 3 rations bags contained hardtack, salted meat, and a little grain. For 12 people, if used sparingly, that would last 3 weeks, maybe 4 if they tightened their belts. Dan counted everything out. He divided it into daily rations. He set a rule. He would personally distribute the food twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. No exceptions. The nobleman in the tattered doublet said he wasn't used to being told what to do by some convict. Dan looked at him and said that there were no convicts or nobles here. There were people here who would either work together or die one by one. The nobleman fell silent, but Dan could see that he hadn't agreed. He'd simply decided to wait. The scouts returned 2 hours later. The news was good. On the other side of the slope, about a half-hour's walk away, there was a clear spring. The water was transparent, odorless, and free of scum. Grass grew nearby, and there were even bushes bearing some small berries. Dan nodded. He mentally divided the island into 2 zones. The western side, with the oil seeps, was the work zone. The eastern side, with the clear water, was the living area. Between them lay a half-hour walk along a rocky slope. The first thing to do was to clear a path. Dan took Hank and the deserter and began clearing a path between the 2 sides of the island. The work was hard. Rocks, prickly bushes, sections slippery with oil. The body he'd been given wasn't built for this kind of labor. 2 hours later, Dan was sitting on a rock, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. His back was on fire. Hank looked at him and said that for a treasury advisor he was holding up pretty well. There was no mockery in his voice. Dan replied that he was full of surprises. By the end of the second day, they had trampled out a semblance of a trail, rough and winding but passable. They moved camp to a clear spring. They set up the shelter again. This time it turned out better. Hank knew how to tie knots and set up the frame, and Dan suggested how to position the shelter so the wind wouldn't blow inside. In the evening, they burned kerosene in a clay pot again. The fire burned steadily and strongly. Dan watched it and thought. He needed a copper kettle. Without a kettle, he couldn't start the distillation. Without distillation, he wouldn't have kerosene. Without kerosene, he wouldn't have any merchandise. Without a product, there would be no trade. Without trade, they would die here once the hardtack ran out. The chain of events was simple and brutal. Everything hinged on a single copper kettle, which he didn't have. The 3rd day began with a discovery. Dan surveyed the western shore more thoroughly than he had the day before. He found 3 large oil seeps on the surface. 2 were simply puddles in rocky depressions. The 3rd was more interesting. Oil was oozing from a crack in the rock under pressure. A thin stream trickled down the rock and collected in a natural pool the size of a dining table. Dan lowered a stick into the pool. It was about a meter deep. He sniffed the oil. It was light, low sulfur, perfect for simple distillation. Near the 3rd seepage, he found something else. A rock with marks carved into it. Not cracks, nor natural markings. The lines were too straight, too deliberate. Dan crouched down and ran his finger over the marks. Some of them looked like symbols, some like diagrams. One group of marks bore a striking resemblance to a fractional distillation diagram that Dan had seen 1,000 times in textbooks. A column with offsets at different levels, temperatures, flow rates. Dan sat in front of that stone and felt a chill run down his spine. Someone here already knew. Someone 200 years ago or even earlier had already realized that the black sludge wasn't a curse but a raw material. And that someone had left records, carved them into the stone so they would survive the test of time. Dan ran his hand over the surface of the rock. The stone was smooth from the wind and salt. The markings were almost worn away. Another 50 years and they would have vanished completely. He memorized the rock's location and headed back to camp.
For now, he kept this discovery to himself. On the third night, the temperature dropped even further. The wind from the sea carried moisture and cold. The exiles huddled around the oil fire and remained silent. His sick brother regained his senses a little after being given clean water to drink, but he was weak and unable to work. Dan sat by the fire and did the math. 12 mouths to feed. Enough food for 3 weeks. Almost no tools. No metal. The only useful items were a single axe, 2 knives, and a clay pot.
And oil, an endless supply of oil right beneath their feet. He went over everything he knew about primitive distillation in his head. Without a copper kettle, he could try using clay, mold a sealed vessel with a tube to vent the steam, fire it in the kiln, fill it with oil, heat it up. The steam will travel through the tube. If the tube is cooled with water, the steam will condense. The first fraction, at temperatures up to 70 degrees, is gasoline. Too volatile and dangerous. Let it pass through. The second fraction, ranging from 150 to 250, is kerosene. That's what we need. It burns evenly, doesn't explode at room temperature, and is ideal for lamps. The third fraction, above 300, is fuel oil. Heavy fuel for boilers and furnaces. The residue is bitumen. Roads, waterproofing, roofing. From a single batch of crude oil, you can obtain 4 different products, each with its own market. But all of that was theory. Practice, however, required a boiler, or at least something resembling one. On the morning of the 4th day, Dan gathered everyone together. He said they had 2 options. The first was to sit and wait for death. The second was to get to work. He said he knew how to turn the black sludge they were all shying away from into lamp oil, clean, bright and soot-free. Such oil costs more on the mainland than whale blubber. He said that if they could set up production and wait for at least 1 merchant ship, they'd have a chance. Hank asked how the Treasury advisor knew about lamp oil and distillation. Dan replied that he had studied it before entering public service. That was almost true. It's just that he'd studied in another world. The nobleman said it was madness, and that the black sludge was a sign of demonic corruption, as the church teaches. The former priest nodded and muttered something about defilement. Dan looked at the priest and asked which was worse, demonic corruption or starving to death in 3 weeks. The priest fell silent. Dan began assigning tasks. He instructed Hank and the deserter to look for clay. Good, dense clay that holds its shape. He sent the brothers to gather reeds and build a wood-drying rack. He put the peasants to work gathering water. He ordered the nobleman to describe everything in the camp, every object, every tool, every piece of rope. He instructed the priest to look after the sick. Dan gave a separate task to the man with the short haircut, who still hadn't said a word. To walk the entire length of the island along the shore and mentally map it out, the coves, headlands, beaches and cliffs.
The man nodded and left. Dan watched him go. This man moved like a hunter, or like a soldier, or like someone sent to make sure the exiles were dead. That left the woman. Pale, calm, silent. She was sitting on a rock, looking at Dan. He walked over to her. He said she needed something to do too. She replied for the first time in 3 days. Her voice was quiet, even and emotionless. She said she knew who he was, not who he claimed to be, but who he really was. Dan froze. She said that Daniel Crow Jr., an assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury, had died in prison a week before being sent to the island, from poison. She knew this because she had worked in the secret office and had seen the report. And the person now standing before her in Daniel Crow's body was someone else. Dan remained silent. The wind ruffled his hair. The woman looked at him and waited. He asked her name. She said her name was Clara Vesper, a former secret bureau agent, exiled for overhearing a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Dan sat down next to her on a rock. He was silent for a minute. Then he said she was right. He wasn't Daniel Crowe. He didn't know how he'd ended up in this body, but he knew how to make sure all 12 people on this island stayed alive. He said he needed her help, or at least her silence. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said that silence came at a high price. Dan nodded and said he'd pay. She asked how. He said with the truth. When there was something to tell, he'd tell her first. Clara stood up and went to help the brothers gather the flippers. She didn't say yes or no, but she didn't tell the others. For now, that was enough. They found the clay on the 5th day. Hank hauled back a hefty lump of reddish clay from the eastern slope, where a spring was eroding the bank. The clay was dense and rich. Dan kneaded it in his hands and realized it would work. Not perfect, but it would do for a first vessel. He spent 2 days shaping it. His hands felt foreign and unfamiliar. His fingers refused to obey him the way he wanted. But his engineering mind was at work, and Dan built not by feel but by calculation. The vessel had to be sealed, with a narrow neck for loading and an outlet tube through which steam would escape. The tube had to slope downward at an angle. A condenser was needed at the tube's outlet. Seawater in a separate container would flow through the tube. The steam would cool and turn into liquid.
The first fraction, the lightest one, would drain away. The second fraction, the one he needed, would flow into a collection vessel. Dan fashioned the vessel and the outlet tube. The tube turned out crooked and thick, not so much a pipe as a clay trough with a lid. He made the condenser from a hollowed-out log, filled it with seawater, and ran the tube through it. They fired it over an oil bonfire. The heat from the burning oil was so intense that the clay fired in just a few hours. Dan checked the vessel for cracks. There were 2 small ones along the body. He patched them with fresh clay and fired it again. On the 7th day, the setup was ready. Primitive, ugly, and fragile. But it was a distillation column. More precisely, not even a column, but the simplest distillation cube. The column would come later. For now, at least a cube. Dan poured crude oil into the vessel, about 3 liters from that natural pool. He lit a fire beneath the vessel. The oil began to heat up. All 12 people stood around watching, even the nobleman, even the priest. Dan monitored the temperature the only way he knew how. He spat against the side of the vessel. If the spit sizzled and evaporated instantly, it meant the temperature was above 100. If it sizzled but lingered for a couple of seconds, it meant it was around 100. Rough, unscientific, but at the oil refinery he'd seen veteran operators who determined the temperature in the column by the sound. Here it was pretty much the same. The first vapor appeared after 20 minutes. Light, almost transparent, with a pungent odor. These were gasoline fractions, highly flammable and dangerous. Dan held out a clay dish and collected the first drops of condensate. The liquid was clear, almost like water. He sniffed it. Gasoline. Pure or nearly pure gasoline. Dan set the dish aside and warned everyone not to bring any open flame near it. Hank asked why. Dan said that this liquid would ignite from a spark and could kill someone. Hank took 2 steps back. Dan tossed some firewood into the fire under the cube. The temperature rose. The gasoline fractions ran out. Another vapor began to rise. It was heavier and had a different smell. The condensate in the new pan was slightly yellowish, oily to the touch. Dan sniffed it. Then he took a thin splinter, dipped it in the liquid and lit it.
The splinter caught fire with an even yellow flame without any soot. The flame was steady. It didn't flare up, but burned calmly and strongly.
Kerosene. Dan held the burning splinter and watched the fire. That little yellow tongue of flame was worth more than all the gold in the treasury of the Valestin Empire, because gold doesn't burn. But kerosene does, evenly, for a long time, brightly, cheaply. He looked at Hank. Hank was staring at the fire, not understanding. Not yet, anyway. But he would understand. The distillation continued for another hour. After the kerosene came the heavier fractions. Dan collected each one in a separate container. From 3 liters of crude oil he obtained about a glass of gasoline, a little more than a glass of kerosene, half a glass of a heavier fraction, and a thick black residue at the bottom of the vessel. Bitumen. The yield was small. The losses were enormous. Half the product had evaporated through cracks in the vessel. The tube didn't cool properly. There was no temperature control whatsoever. But it worked. That evening, Dan made his first lamp. A small clay bowl with a piece of soaked rag serving as the wick. Kerosene. He lit the wick and placed the lamp on a rock in the center of the shed. A warm, even light flooded the small space. No soot, no stench, pure light. The exiles watched in silence. The former priest stopped muttering his prayers and fell silent, his mouth agape. Hank reached out toward the lamp and immediately pulled his hand back, not because of the heat, out of surprise. He said he'd never seen such a pure flame in his life. Dan said this was just the beginning. On the 8th day, he carried out a second distillation. On the 9th, a third. Each time he improved the process. He sealed the cracks. He lengthened the tube. He adjusted the angle. By the 10th day, the kerosene yield from a single batch had doubled. The still was still fragile. The clay cracked from the temperature fluctuations. After every third distillation, he had to rebuild it from scratch, but things were moving forward. Dan began stockpiling kerosene. He poured it into clay pots and stored them in the shade, away from the fire. By the end of the 2nd week, he had about 5 liters of kerosene. Not much, negligibly little for trade, but enough to keep 3 lamps burning every evening at the camp and keep things lit. At the same time, he was tackling other problems. Food was the main one. They were running out of crackers. Hank started fishing from the shore. He made his own tackle out of rope and a bent nail. The fishing wasn't great here. The oil slick on the water scared the schools of fish away. But on the eastern side, where the water was clear, he caught small, silvery fish resembling herring. Not much, but at least it was something. The deserter turned out to be a good hunter. He found a colony of seabirds on the island and began collecting eggs. The birds nested on the cliffs above the eastern shore. Climbing up there was dangerous, but the deserter climbed up every morning and brought back 10 to 15 eggs. The peasants found edible roots and wild onions. Not much, but starvation was ceded a step. Dan noticed that the camp was beginning to change. Not abruptly, not all at once, but people began to move differently. In the morning, they got up and went to work without being ordered. In the evening, they gathered around the lamps and talked. For the first time in 2 weeks, someone laughed. One of the brothers told how he'd stolen a whole goose at the market, and the goose had bitten him on the nose right in front of a guard. The laughter was hoarse and faint, but genuine. People were coming back to life. On the 12th day, Dan woke up to someone shaking his shoulder. It was a man with a crew cut, the very same one Dan hadn't been able to read. He said 3 words. A ship on the horizon. Dan jumped up and ran toward the western shore. A silhouette was visible on the horizon through the morning mist. A small ship, a 2-masted vessel. It was sailing along the coast at a distance of about a mile. Not an imperial ship.
Imperial ships had red sails with a golden sun. This ship's sails were grey and dirty. A smuggler, or a pirate, or just a merchant who'd taken a wrong turn. Dan stood on the shore and thought. This was his chance. His first and possibly his only one. If this ship passed by, they might have to wait months for the next one. He turned to Hank, who was standing nearby. He said they needed to get the ship's attention. Hank said it might be a pirate and that pirates would just kill them. Dan replied that starvation would kill them first. They lit a signal fire at the highest point on the shore. The burning oil sent up a column of thick, black smoke that rose straight up into the windless morning. The ship spotted the smoke. It changed course and headed toward the island. Dan stood on the shore and waited. Behind him stood 11 men. They had 1 axe and 2 knives. If they were pirates, they would die. If it was a merchant, they would have a chance. The ship drew closer.
Standing on the bow was a figure in men's clothing with an uncovered red head. Binoculars. No, a spyglass. The figure lowered the spyglass and shouted something to the crew. The ship dropped anchor 200 meters from the shore. A rowboat was lowered from the deck. 4 rowers and a red-haired figure at the stern. When the skiff drew nearer, Dan saw that it was a woman. Young, weather-beaten, with green eyes and a scattering of freckles on her sunburned nose. She leaped onto the rocks as easily as if she did it every day. She surveyed the shore. She looked at the exiles. Her gaze lingered on the black oil streaks on the rocks. Then she looked at Dan and said this was Crescendo, and that normal people didn't come here. She asked what they were doing here. Dan replied that they were living. She smirked and said it was only temporary. He said he'd be willing to bet on it. She said her name was Johanna Rice, that her ship was a brig called the Grey Seagull, and that she was here because she'd been hiding from an Imperial patrol and had decided to round Crescendo on the leeward side. She said she'd just been planning to take on some water and head out. Dan nodded. Then he asked Hank to bring a lamp. Hank brought it. Dan lit it in front of Johanna. She stared at the clean, steady flame. He said it was lamp oil made from the black sludge that covered the entire island. He said it burned brighter and swelling than whale blubber. He said he had 5 liters, and there would be more, much more. He offered a deal. 2 barrels of this oil for food, grain, tools, a goat if available. Johanna looked at the lamp, then at Dan, then back at the lamp. She took the lamp in her hands and held it up to her face. The light fell on her freckles and red hair. She asked how much of this oil he could produce in a month. Dan said that with good equipment, a barrel a week, maybe more. She asked what he needed. He said, a copper cauldron, the bigger the better. Iron pipes, tools, nails, food, cloth, soap. Johanna thought for a minute. Then she said she'd be back in 10 days. She said she'd bring the cauldron and everything else, but if the oil turned out to be junk, she wouldn't come back. Dan said it wouldn't. She got into the rowboat and rowed away. The Grey Seagull weighed anchor and sailed off over the horizon. Dan stood on the shore and watched her go. Hank walked over and stood beside him. He asked how Dan knew she'd come back. Dan replied that whale blubber was worth a gold coin per barrel on the mainland. He'd be selling the kerosene for a quarter of that price. No smuggler in the world would pass up a margin like that. Hank didn't know the word margin. Dan said it meant profit. Hank nodded. They walked back to camp. 10 days. They had 10 days to make as much kerosene as they could. Those 10 days turned into a race. Dan ran the still from morning until dark. The clay cube would crack every 2 or 3 cycles, and they'd have to mold it all over again. Dan taught Hank how to make the cubes. He didn't explain why each part was necessary, he just showed him. It's thicker here, thinner here.
The tube at this angle. Hank picked it up right away. A fisherman's hands were used to the delicate work of handling nets, and he molded the cubes more carefully than Dan. By the 5th day of the race, they had 3 cubes that they ran in rotation. While one was heating up, the second was cooling down, and the third was being repaired. Kerosene was piling up. A deserter named Ron found a small cave with a dry floor in the rocks. Dan designated it as a storage area. Pots of kerosene were lined up along the wall. Dan counted the liters. He needed at least 40 to fill 2 barrels. Of course, they didn't have 2 real barrels. But Hank cobbled together 2 makeshift barrels from the wreckage of a fin and some resin. They were crooked and leaky, but Dan sealed the seams with bitumen and they stopped leaking. Everyone pitched in, even the nobleman. His name was Leonard Ashby, and he turned out to be more useful than Dan had thought. Leonard could write quickly and legibly. Dan put him in charge of keeping records. How much oil they loaded, how much kerosene they produced, how much was lost, how much gasoline was left, and how much bitumen remained. Leonard wrote everything down with a piece of charcoal on flat stones because there was no paper. Dan looked at his notes and thought that when paper became available, the first thing he'd do was draw up a proper material balance sheet. The priest's name was Father Quentin. He stopped muttering prayers and began to help out. He carried water for cooling. He added firewood to the bonfire. But Dan could see that every time Father Quentin looked at the oil fire, a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. The Church of the Bright Sun taught that everything black that came from the earth was the devil's work.
Father Quentin had believed this for 20 years. Now he was helping to boil that very work of the devil in a pot, and the light from the lamp warmed him at night. His faith was cracking. Dan saw this and didn't press the issue. Time would do its work. Clara V's worked silently and efficiently. She carried oil from the pool to the vats in clay pots. She did it methodically and quickly. Every time she passed Dan, she looked at him as if she were measuring him, weighing him, deciding. Dan didn't rush her. On the 6th day of the race, the first accident happened. One of the brothers, the older one named Phil, was heating a cube and got distracted. The temperature rose too high. The steam in the tube turned into pressure. The cube burst. Burning oil splashed onto the rocks. Phil jumped back, but the splashes hit his arm. The burn was severe. His skin turned red and blistered from his wrist to his elbow. Phil was screaming. His brother Mark rushed over to him. Dan grabbed a pot of seawater and poured it over Phil's arm. Then he examined the burn. 2nd degree. Painful, but not life-threatening, as long as it didn't get infected. He wrapped the arm in a clean cloth and told Phil not to remove the bandage and to change it twice a day. Then he gathered everyone together. He stood before them and spoke slowly and clearly. He said it was his fault because he hadn't explained the safety rules. He said that oil and everything made from it is not a toy. It can kill. Gasoline ignites from a spark. Vapors are explosive. An overheated cube explodes like a bomb. He established 3 rules. First, no open flames near gasoline or kerosene except in lamps. Second, someone must always stand by the cube and keep watch. You may only step away once you've been relieved. Third, at any strange sound coming from the cube, everyone must step back 10 paces. He repeated the rules twice. Hank repeated after him. The others nodded. There were no more accidents. On the 8th day, Dan took stock of their supplies. 35 liters of kerosene. Not enough. They needed 5 more. He doubled the load in the cubes. They worked through the night by the light of their own lamps. On the 9th day, a man with a crew cut approached Dan. He said his name was Marcus Gray. He said that before his arrest, he had served as a corporal in the Imperial Infantry.
He deserted after his company commander ordered him to burn down a village on the border with Kadir because the peasants were selling grain to both sides. Marcus refused. He was arrested. Dan listened in silence. Marcus said he had explored the entire island as Dan had asked. The island stretches from west to east, about 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. To the west are oil seeps and black cliffs. To the east there's open land, a spring, and a bird colony. To the north, a rocky cliff. To the south, the only suitable bay with a shallow bottom where a ship can anchor. Further to the southeast, he found ruins, old stone walls overgrown with brush. The foundation of some large building, maybe a temple, maybe a fortress. Inside, he found fragments of stone slabs with symbols carved into them. Dan looked up. Symbols, just like the ones he'd found near the oil field. He asked Marcus to take him there. The two of them headed southeast. The ruins turned out to be larger than Dan had expected. The stone foundation was rectangular, 20 by 30 meters. The walls were still standing to a height of 2 or 3 courses of masonry. Inside were fragments of columns and pieces of slabs. On one of the slabs, Dan found what he was looking for. Symbols. Dozens of symbols carved into the stone. And among them were things that made his mouth go dry. A diagram of a distillation apparatus. Not a primitive cube, but a real distillation column with trays. Next to it was a shelf of something resembling a reactor vessel. And formulas. Chemical formulas written not in modern notation but still recognizable. Hydrocarbon chains. The cracking process. The breakdown of heavy fruits into lighter ones under the influence of temperature and pressure. Someone on this island knew petrochemistry hundreds of years ago. Not at the level of an engineer from a plant in Houston, but at a level sufficient to build a distillation column and start the cracking process. And that person vanished. His knowledge had been erased from history. His temple lies in ruins. For 200 years, the Empire has kept the island under a curse so that no one would venture here. Dan sat in front of the stone slab and felt a picture taking shape in his mind, one he couldn't yet see in its entirety. But the edges were already coming into view, and he didn't like what he saw. Marcus stood nearby, silent. Then he said he didn't understand these symbols, but could tell that Dan did.
And he asked if he should be worried. Dan stood up and dusted off his knees. He said there was cause for concern, but not about that. Right now, their main concern was getting 40 liters of kerosene by tomorrow morning. They returned to camp.
On the 10th day, right on schedule, grey sails appeared on the horizon. The grey seagull was heading toward the island. Dan stood on the shore next to 2 barrels coated with bitumen. 42 liters of kerosene. He'd made it in time. Johanna came ashore and immediately inspected the barrels. She opened the lid. She sniffed. She dipped her finger in and rubbed it between her fingers. Then she asked for a light. Dan gave her a splinter. She dipped it into the barrel and lit it. The flame was even, pure gold. Johanna blew out the splinter and looked at Dan. There was something new in her eyes. Not distrust. Calculation. She said she hadn't seen oil like this in any port from the capital to the southern islands. She asked how much he could produce if he had a real boiler. Dan replied that with a copper boiler and proper pipes, he'd produce a barrel of kerosene a week, 4 barrels a month. In 3 months, he'd install a second unit. In 6 months, a third. Johanna silently did the math in her head. Then she turned to her bosun and ordered the unloading to begin. They hauled the copper boiler from the rowboat onto the shore. It was old and dented, with a green patina, but it was copper and large, 30 liters. Next came the sacks, grain, salted meat, dried beans, salt, and a sack of nails, 2 hammers, a saw, a coil of rope, a piece of sailcloth, and a goat tied to the side of the rowboat, a live red goat that was bleating as if it were being slaughtered.
Hank took the goat with such tenderness as if it were his granddaughter. Dan stood there looking at the copper cauldron. He placed his palm on it. The metal was cold and smooth. With this kettle, he would build a proper distillation apparatus. With a proper apparatus, he would begin producing kerosene in quantities sufficient for real trade. With trade would come people. With people would come a workforce. With a workforce, he would build everything else. A chain. Always a chain. Each link pulls the next one along. Johanna approached him and said she'd be back in a month. She said she had a buyer on the mainland who would take any kind of fuel oil at a good price. She said that if Dan kept his word and supplied 4 barrels a month, she'd bring him anything he asked for. Iron pipes, sheet metal, tools, even people if needed. Dan said he needed people. She nodded and left. The grey seagull weighed anchor and vanished over the horizon.
That evening, Dan cooked for the first time over a real fire, using real ingredients. Grain porridge with salted pork. A simple, rough meal, but after 3 weeks on crackers and bird eggs, it was a feast. The men ate in silence, focused on their food. A goat tied to a post under the shed chewed grass and stared at the fire with its yellow eyes. Hank said the goat gave milk, and that if they found a billy goat for her in 6 months, they'd have a herd. Dan nodded. He was already thinking ahead. The copper kettle. Tomorrow he'd start building a real distillation apparatus, not a clay cube, but a copper system with tubes and a condenser. Kerosene output would quadruple. Losses would be cut in half, and that would be just a beginning. The copper kettle changed everything. Dan spent 3 days turning it into a still. He cut a hole in the lid for the outlet tube. He made the tube from a flattened piece of sheet metal that Johanna had left among the tools. He bent it into a half-cylinder and soldered the seams with molten lead that he scraped from Hank's old fishing sinkers. He built a new condenser, a long wooden trough hollowed out of a log and filled with running water. Marcus dug a channel from the nearest stream to the trough so that the water would be constantly refreshed. The tube wound through the trough in 3 coils. The longer the steam travels through the cold water, the more condensate is produced, the fewer the losses. The first distillation rung on the copper still yielded a result that made Dan smile for the first time in many days. From 10 litres of crude oil, he obtained nearly 3 litres of kerosene, a 30% yield. At the plant in Houston, with its multi-tray distillation column, the kerosene yield reached 40%. 30% from a copper still with a curved tube was more than respectable. He set the still to continuous operation, 2 distillations a day, loading in the morning, first drain by lunchtime, second loading after lunch, second drain by evening. 6 litres of kerosene per day, a barrel a week with a little to spare. Hank became the second operator. Dan trained him patiently and in detail. Watch the color of the vapor. If it's clear, that means the light fraction is coming through. If it's yellowish, that means kerosene is coming through. If the vapor turns white and thick, that means the temperature is too high and fuel oil is coming through. Switch the receiver. Hank listened. Hank memorized it.
Hank didn't ask questions like, why? He asked questions like, what if the vapor turns grey and smells like rotten eggs? Dan explained, grey vapor that smells like rotten eggs means hydrogen sulfide is coming through. It's a poisonous gas. Step away. Don't breathe it in. Wait until it clears. Hank nodded and the next day repeated everything to Ron, the deserter who had become the third operator. The knowledge spread down the chain. Dan did this on purpose. If they killed him tomorrow, Hank would be able to run the kerosene. If they killed Hank, Ron would be able to. The system must not depend on a single person. That was the first rule of engineering that Dan remembered from back at the factory. If you're the only one who knows how to start up the unit, then the unit is already broken. It just doesn't know it yet. Alongside the distillation, Dan was tackling the housing problem. The shed was no longer fit for purpose. They needed walls, a roof, and floors. Marcus suggested using the ruins of an old temple as a foundation. The stone walls were already standing. They just needed to build up the walls and cover them with a roof. Dan agreed. They moved their camp to the ruins. The masonry of the ancient builders was superb. The blocks were fitted tightly together without mortar and had stood for hundreds of years. Dan and Marcus extended the walls with 2 rows of local stone held together by a mixture of clay and bitumen. There was plenty of bitumen. It remained in the still as a heavy black sediment after each distillation. Dan mixed it with sand to make something resembling cement. Not real cement, but it would do for the walls of the first house on this cursed island. They built the roof out of poles and canvas. Later they'd replace it with tiles if they found suitable clay. They poured the same bitumen mixture over the floor. It hardened into a smooth black surface. Not pretty, but dry and warm. By the end of the first month, a house stood on the island. 1 house for 12 people. Cramped, but walls, a roof, the floor, 3 kerosene lamps inside, warmth and light. Hank sat in that house that first evening and said nothing. Then he said that in 30 years at sea he'd never had a home better than this one. Dan didn't reply. He sat in a corner and, by lamplight, drew with charcoal on a flat stone. He was drawing a diagram of a future distillation column, not a still, but a real column with trays. Each tray represents a temperature level.
The bottom one is the hottest. At the top, it's the lowest. Crude oil is fed in from the bottom. Steam rises upward. Each tray condenses its own fraction. At the bottom, fuel oil and bitumen. In the middle, kerosene. At the top, gasoline and gases. A single feed, and at the outlet, all the products are immediately separated by fraction. For a column like this, you need metal. A lot of metal. Sheet iron, or better yet, copper. Tubes, valves, thermometers. He didn't have any of that. For now. Johanna returned a month later, as promised. This time she brought more than just supplies. 6 people came with her. 4 men and 2 women, discharged sailors and runaway serfs. People without a home, without a future, and without a choice. Johanna said a rumor had spread across the continent. Crescendo. The cursed island. Someone lives there. Someone is burning the devil's fire. Some were frightened. Others came to her and asked if they could go there. She took those who weren't afraid of hard work. Dan accepted them. He assigned each of them a task within the first hour, 2 to extract oil, 1 to work on construction, 1 woman named Greta to the kitchen, a second named Lynn to do sewing. Sailcloth doesn't last forever. We need clothes. We need sacks. We need wicks for the lamps. He assigned the 6th man, a strong, quiet fellow named Tom, to Hank's distillery as an apprentice. 18 people, kerosene, a home, food, regular trade. In a month, Dan had gone from a group of dying exiles in chains to a small, functioning work crew. He knew this was only the beginning and that the real difficulties were still ahead. But now, on this evening, as 18 people sat in the stone house by the light of kerosene lamps and ate hot porridge with goat's milk, he allowed himself a single second of peace. 1 second in which he didn't think about convoys, factions, or trade routes. 1 second in which he simply sat and listened as Hank told the newcomers about their first night on the island, when Dan had brought a pot of black sludge and lit a fire out of nothing. Hank told the story as if it were a legend. Dan listened and thought that legends were a good thing. Legends draw people in. And he needed people. Lots of people. Clara Vesper sat across from him and looked at him. She wasn't smiling, but in her eyes Dan saw something new. Not suspicion, interest, maybe even respect. She waited until the others had fallen asleep. Then she walked over to him. She said that Marcus Gray, with his short haircut, wasn't a deserter. Or rather, he wasn't just a deserter.
His real last name was Graves, Marcus Graves, a former officer in Duke Morvain's personal guard, dismissed after he refused to carry out an order. She didn't know what order it was, but the fact that a man who had served Morvain personally and then ended up on the same ship as Daniel Crow was no coincidence. Dan looked at Clara in silence. Then he asked why she was telling him this. Clara replied that he had promised to pay with the truth. She decided to make the first move. Dan nodded. He looked at Marcus, who was sleeping in the corner, the man who had helped him survey the island, who had dug the trench for the cooler, who had worked silently and asked no unnecessary questions. This man could have been sent to make sure Dan was dead, and he wasn't dead. Not dead at all. Dan lay down and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep until dawn. Dan didn't touch Marcus, not because he trusted him. It was because Marcus was useful. He was the only one on the island who knew how to command people so that they would obey without resentment. He knew how to build. He knew how to assign tasks. He knew how to find a stone of the right shape at a glance. If Marcus were removed now, construction would come to a halt, and construction could not stop. By the 5th week, Crescendo's population had grown by 7 more people. Johanna hadn't brought them there on purpose. They'd come on their own. 2 had sailed over in a fishing boat from a coastal village. The landowner had evicted them for debts, and they had nowhere else to go. 5 arrived on a barge that smugglers from another route had sent to Crescendo after Johanna let slip in a harbour tavern that people lived on the cursed island and burned oil that never went out. 25 people. Dan realized he needed a system, not friendly agreements, but rules. He gathered everyone that evening around a large bonfire in front of the house. He announced that starting that day, laws would be in effect on the island, not imperial ones, their own. First law: everyone who works gets a share. The share is calculated in daily rations. 1 day's work equals 1 ration. 2 rations for hard or dangerous work. Smugglers get 2. Builders get 1.5. Kitchen staff get 1. No one works for free. No one eats for free. The second law: theft is punishable by banishment from the island, not by beatings, not by shackles, by banishment. Dan said he understood that this was harsh.
But food is scarce and the population is growing, and if someone steals, they steal from everyone. The third law: disputes are settled by the council. The council consists of Dan, Hank, and Marcus. 3 votes. The majority decides. If someone disagrees with a decision, they can request a review in 3 days. Dan deliberately included Marcus on the council. If Marcus is a spy, it's better to have him inside the system where he can be watched than outside where he can plot conspiracies. The fourth law: children do not work. There haven't been any children on the island yet, but Dan knew there would be, and when there were, they would go to school, not to the distillation cube. He said this out loud. The others exchanged glances. A school, on this damned island, for the children of exiles and fugitives. Hank smirked and asked who would teach them. Dan looked at Leonard Ashby. The impoverished nobleman was sitting in the back row, trying hard to pretend he wasn't there. Dan said that Leonard could read and write in 3 languages and knew history and arithmetic. Leonard blushed. Then he turned pale. Then he said that he certainly wasn't opposed to it, but there was no one to teach. Dan replied that there was no one yet, but there would be soon. And by that time, Leonard would have prepared a curriculum. Leonard blinked. He looked at Dan as if Dan had offered him the throne. Then he nodded and said nothing. Johanna arrived at the beginning of the 6th week. This time her ship was sitting deeper in the water than usual. The hold was packed. She had brought 3 barrels of grain, a sack of seeds, 2 rolls of cloth, ropes, 10 meters of iron pipe, a toolbox, and a person.
a young woman with a black braid and dark skin. The woman stood on the shore, looking around with the expression people have when they realize their life has just taken a completely unexpected turn. Johanna said she'd found her 3 days ago. She'd found her in the water. The girl was clinging to a piece of driftwood and was nearly dead. The ship she'd been on had run into a storm and crashed into the rocks south of the archipelago. The girl was the only survivor. Dan walked up to her and asked her name. She replied in broken Imperial with a strong southern accent. Mireille Son, the daughter of a merchant from the Sultanate of Qadir. She had been sailing with her husband. Her husband had drowned. She said this without emotion, as if stating a fact. Dan gave her dry clothes and a hot meal. He didn't ask any further thanks. There was still time. The next day, Mide came out of the house where she had slept and sat down silently next to Leonard, who was making calculations on the stones. She looked at the numbers. A minute later, she said he'd made a mistake in the third line. Leonard checked. She was right. He'd miscalculated by 2 sacks of grain. Mide recalculated all the entries for the past 3 weeks in her head faster than Leonard could do it on the charcoal-stained stone. She found 4 more errors. Dan stood nearby and listened. Then he walked over to her and said he needed an accountant, someone who could keep track of everything: income, expenses, inventory, losses, and debts. He said that his mind was filled only with chemistry and that he wasn't very good at math. That wasn't entirely true, but Mide didn't need to know that. She looked up at him. Something alive flashed in her dark eyes, the first sign of life since she'd arrived. She asked if her word would carry any weight. Dan said that if she found a mistake in his calculations, her word would be the deciding factor. Mide nodded. From that day on, she began to keep track of everything. She counted everything: liters of kerosene, kilograms of grain, hours worked, oil consumption per distillation run, and the cost of a barrel of kerosene in terms of the food she could trade for it with Johanna. A week later, she came to Dan with a stone on which neat columns of numbers had been carved. She said that at the current rate of oil consumption and kerosene yield, they were losing 20% of the product during cooling. The tube was too short. The vapor doesn't have time to condense and escapes into the air. If they lengthen the tube and add a second coil to the cooler, the yield will increase by 15%. Dan looked at her numbers. He looked at her. He said she was absolutely right. Mire didn't smile, but her shoulders straightened slightly. Just a tiny bit. Dan used the iron pipes that Johanna had brought to upgrade the distillation apparatus. He replaced the bent tube made of flattened iron with a real iron pipe featuring 3 coils in the condenser. The kerosene yield increased from 30 to 40%. Mire wrote down the new figures and, for the first time in 2 weeks, said the word, good. The population was growing. By the end of the 2nd month, 36 people were living on the island. Dan began building a second house.
Marcus supervised the construction. They took stone from the ruins and from the cliffs on the northern escarpment. They mixed the bitumen mortar by the barrel. The second house was completed in 10 days. It was larger than the first. It had 2 rooms. The windows were covered with oiled cloth. The floor was made of compacted clay coated with bitumen. Dan looked at the 2 houses standing side by side and didn't see houses. He saw the first block of the first street in the first city. But between the houses and the city lay an abyss. And that abyss had to be filled step by step. That evening, Clara approached him again. She said that Marcus had sent a letter on the last ship, a sealed scroll that he'd given to one of Johanna's sailors. Clara knew this because she saw everything. She didn't know what was in the letter, but she knew to whom it was addressed. The Duke of Morvaine's chancellery, the capital. Dan stood watching the sunset. The sea was red from the setting sun. He asked Clara if she could intercept such letters in the future. She said she could.
He asked if she could read them without breaking the seal. She smiled. For the first time ever. Her smile was supple, quick, and a little scary. She said that was her profession. Dan nodded. He said that starting today, Clara was in charge of Crescendo's security. All incoming and outgoing correspondence goes through her. She screens all new people. All suspicious contacts are logged. He said he'd pay her double rations. She shook her head and said she didn't need rations. She needed something else. She wanted to know everything Dan knew. About the formulas on the rocks. About the ancient temple. About who he really is. Everything. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd tell her, when he was ready. She accepted that. She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked away. Dan remained standing on the shore. Marcus is writing to the Duke. That means the Duke will soon find out that the exiles are alive, that fuel oil is being produced on Crescendo, that the island isn't dead. How long would it take from the letter to a response? A month for delivery, a month to process the news, a month to prepare. 3 months, maybe 4, maybe half a year if the Duke is busy with other matters. But there would be a response. Dan knew that, and he had to be ready for that response. He walked back to camp. On the way, he stopped by the distillation apparatus. The copper kettle was quietly puffing away.
Hank was sitting nearby, watching the steam. Tom was sitting next to him, carefully memorizing Hank's every move. Next to them, on a rock, lay Mireille's notes with the day's figures. Dan looked at all this and thought he needed to speed. 3 months wasn't enough. He didn't need a cooperative. He needed a factory. Not a village, a fortress. Not a handful of people, a community capable of defending itself. He picked up Mireille's stone and carried it into the house. At night, by lamplight, he calculated and drew until dawn. The 3rd month began with rain. It rained for 4 days straight. Not a downpour, but a steady, grey drizzle that soaked everything. The roofs were leaking. The bitumen mortar on the walls was getting soggy. The path between the residential area and the distillery turned into a slippery, muddy mess where people fell and broke their fingers and ribs. 2 newcomers fell ill, coughing, fever, weakness. There were no medicines. Father Quentin gave them hot water with wild herbs to drink and prayed. The prayers didn't help much. The herbs helped a little better. Dan looked at the mud on the path and thought, mud. The main enemy of civilization. Not war, not the plague. Mud. A road that turns into a swamp after every rain kills trade and people more reliably than any enemy. He had the answer. Bitumen. That very same black residue that accumulated after every distillation. Until now, Dan had used it only for waterproofing walls and as a binder for masonry. But bitumen is a road. The most reliable road that can be built without concrete or an asphalt plant. He explained to Marcus what needed to be done. Level the trail, remove large rocks, fill it with fine gravel, tamp it down, pour hot bitumen over it, let it set. Marcus listened in silence. Then he asked how much bitumen they'd need. Dan did the math. The trail from the cove to the residential area was about 400 meters long, 2 meters wide. The surface was 5 centimeters thick. That's 4 cubic meters of bitumen. At his current production rate, he'd accumulated about 1.5. He needed another 2.5. It would take 3 weeks if he poured it all onto the road. But he couldn't pour it all onto the road because kerosene was the main product and bitumen was a byproduct. So a month. Marcus nodded and got to work. 12 men cleared the trail while the rain lashed their faces.
Dan worked alongside them. He hauled rocks. He crushed gravel.
His body had grown stronger over the past 2 months, but it was still weaker than Hank's or Marcus's.
Dan made up for it with sheer stubbornness. He didn't stop until the others did. Mira, meanwhile, had set up a full-fledged accounting system. She had no papers, so she used flat stones and charcoal, but the structure was flawless. Raw material intake, product output, inventories, debts owed to Johanna, food consumption, monthly forecast. Dan looked at her tables and recognized in them the logic he'd seen on the computer screen in the planning department at the Houston plant. Mira did this without a computer, without a calculator, in her head and on stone. One evening she asked him how he knew the word profitability. She said it wasn't an imperial word, not a Kadir word. She knew 4 languages, and that word didn't exist in any of them. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd learned it a long time ago, in another life. Mira looked at him with a long, calm gaze. Then she said that she too had had another life, and that she had no intention of returning to it. She lowered her eyes again to the stone with the numbers. Dan realized that the question wasn't really a question. It was a suggestion. You don't ask about my past. I don't ask about yours. We work. That suited him just fine. In the middle of the 3rd month, the first crisis struck. Not an external one, internal. One of the new recruits, a large man named Garth, refused to go out and clear the road. He said he wouldn't be digging around in the mud for a bowl of porridge. He said he'd seen barrels of oil in the cave and that oil was worth money, and the money should be split evenly. He said Dan was taking too much power for himself and that it was time to choose a new leader. Dan stood and listened. People stood around watching. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Sooner or later, someone was bound to challenge him. Not because Dan is a bad leader, but because that's just how people are. When hunger recedes, the first thing to return is ambition. Dan replied calmly. He said that Garth had the right to say whatever he thought. He said that oil really is worth money, and that the money really is being shared. Every worker receives a share proportional to their contribution. It's recorded with Mira. He suggested that Garth look at the records. Garth said he didn't care about the records and that he wanted silver, not porridge. Dan nodded. He said there was no silver on the island.
But if Garth wants to, he can take a rowboat and head to the mainland. He can take his share of kerosene with him, 10 liters. That's his right. On the mainland, he'll sell the kerosene and get silver. Or he'll get robbed, or arrested as a fugitive, or he'll drown. The choice was his. Garth was silent. The people around him were silent. Hank stood behind Dan, holding an axe in his hand. He wasn't threatening him. He was just holding it. Garth looked at the axe. He looked at the faces around him. He looked at Dan. Then he spat on the ground and walked over to the distillery. The next day he worked like everyone else. The crisis was over, but Dan knew there would be more to come. He spoke with Meyer. He said they needed a form of currency, not silver, which they didn't have, but an internal system of exchange that would let people feel that their labor had value. Meyer thought about it for 2 days. Then she suggested tokens, round clay discs with an imprint. 1 token was equal to 1 day's ration. Tokens could be saved up. They could be traded. They could be spent on extra food or clothing or a better spot in the house. Dan approved. He asked Leonard to carve a stamp. Leonard carved a small seal out of bone with the letter K, crescendo. Meyer began issuing tokens, 1 for a day's work, 2 for hard labor, 1.5 for skilled labor. Crescendo's economy was no longer based on barter.
It had become a system, primitive, crude, and small, but a system nonetheless. By the end of the third month, the road was ready. 400 meters of smooth black pavement from the cove to the residential neighborhood. Dan stood on that road and watched as the rain ran off its surface without leaving puddles or mud. The bitumen held up. The water drained into the grooves on the sides that Marcus had thoughtfully carved into the ground. Meyer walked the length of the road from one end to the other without getting her skirt dirty. She was carrying a stack of stones with notes, clutching them to her chest. Before, after it rained, she'd have to wade knee-deep in mud and half the notes would get soaked. Dan watched her and thought that this road was worth every liter of bitumen. Not because it was convenient, but because Meyer no longer loses her notes. One person, one problem, one solution. That evening, Hank approached Dan and said that from the house he could see lights on the horizon. 2 ships were heading toward the island. Dan went down to the shore.
In the darkness, several miles away, lights were glowing. 2 sets. 2 ships. Johanna had gone alone. These weren't her ships. Dan turned to Marcus. Marcus was standing nearby, also looking at the lights. His face betrayed nothing. Absolutely nothing. Dan thought they were either merchants drawn by the rumors or the Duke's men, and he would find out the answer in the morning. The ships turned out to be merchant vessels. 2 small coastal vessels commanded by merchant brothers from the port city of Ulmer. They had come for kerosene. Johanna had sold the first batch of Crescent oil in Ulmer, and it had sold out in 3 days. The merchants saw the demand and decided to sail to the source themselves. Their names were Harvey and Felix Turner. Both were stout, both ruddy-faced, both with identical black beards and shrewd little eyes. They went ashore and first thing stared at the road. A black, smooth road on an island that, according to all the maps, was a barren piece of rock. Harvey touched the surface with his foot and asked what it was. Dan said it was bitumen, a byproduct of oil distillation, a material for roads, water-resistant, durable, cheap. Harvey looked at Felix. Felix looked at Harvey. They both looked at Dan. Felix asked if they could buy this material. Dan said they could, but first kerosene. The negotiations took 2 hours. Mira sat next to Dan and kept track of the numbers. The brothers haggled fiercely. They wanted the kerosene at the same price Johanna had been offered. Dan said no. Johanna got her price because she arrived first and took a risk. The brothers came second and followed a well-trodden path. Their price would be higher. Felix began to protest. Mira quietly named a figure. She said that a barrel of whale oil in Ulmer costs 18 silver coins. Kerosene burns brighter, longer, and cleaner. A fair price is 12 silver coins per barrel of kerosene. That's 1/3 cheaper than whale blubber. The buyer wins, the seller gets enough. Felix opened his mouth and closed it again. He wasn't used to haggling with women, and he certainly wasn't used to a woman knowing the prices in his home market better than he did. Mira knew them. She asked everyone who came to the island about prices in all the ports. She wrote them down. She compared them. She calculated them. The brothers agreed to 12 silver coins per barrel. They bought 4 barrels of kerosene and 1 barrel of bitumen. They paid 6 silver coins for the bitumen.
They also brought goods to trade: sacks of flour, fresh vegetables, 200 nails, 3 coils of wire, a roll of canvas, a small barrel of wine, and some news. The brothers reported that kerosene had caused a sensation in Ulmer. Townspeople lined up for bottles of it. Shopkeepers demanded more. One innkeeper replaced all the candles in his dining room with kerosene lamps, and his establishment became the most popular in town because it was as bright as day inside. But there was other news as well. The Church of the Bright Sun in Ulmer declared kerosene to be a devilish potion.
The local bishop delivered a sermon stating that light must come from a candle, which is a symbol of prayer, and that anything that burns from the black earth is a devilish deception. The innkeeper was threatened with excommunication. He took down the lamps. Then he hung them back up when he saw that customers were leaving for a competitor's place, which was dark. Dan heard this and wasn't surprised. He knew the church would be a problem. 200 years of teaching about the impurity of black earth cannot be undone by a single lamp. But the lamps burn every night. And every night, people see that the light is pure and steady and carries no demonic evil. Time is on his side. The brothers had sailed away. Dan sat with Mia and counted the takings. 54 silver coins. Crescendo's first real money. Mia laid the coins out on a rock and counted them 3 times. Then she looked up at Dan and said that if he wanted to build a rectification column, he'd need sheet metal. A lot of sheet metal. With 54 silver coins, you can buy 200 pounds of sheet copper in Ulmer. That's enough for a column 3 meters tall with 4 plates. Dan looked at her and said she'd already researched the prices for sheet copper. Mia said she'd researched the prices for everything. He asked her to place an order with Johanna for the next shipment. Copper sheet, copper wire, solder, bricks, clay molds, tools. Mia wrote everything down on a stone tablet. Dan gave her 30 coins for the order. The remaining 24 went into the general fund. Mia set up a separate ledger for financial transactions, income, expenses, and balance. Dan watched her work and thought he'd found Crescendo's chief financial officer. Between visits from merchants, Dan didn't sit idle. He began planning the next phase. The distillation column was the goal.
But before the column, there were a dozen minor problems to solve. The first problem was the pumps. Oil from natural pools was scooped out with buckets, a slow, cumbersome and dangerous process because people were breathing in the vapors while standing over the puddles. Dan sketched a diagram of the simplest hand pump. A wooden cylinder, a lever piston stuffed with tow, a pipe leading down into the pool, a pipe leading up into a barrel. You pump the lever, the piston moves up and down, the oil flows through the pipe. Marcus built the first pump in 4 days. It worked. It creaked, wobbled, and spit oil every 5th stroke, but it worked. One man with the pump could extract as much oil in an hour as 3 men with buckets could in half a day. The second problem was storage. The barrels made of flounder skin and bitumen leaked and stank. Johanna brought in proper barrels, but there weren't enough of them. Dan began experimenting with firing clay. Large clay jugs, fired at high temperatures by the oil flame and coated on the inside with a thin layer of bitumen. Not ideal, but they were cheap and could be made from local materials. Father Quentin, unexpectedly, turned out to be a good potter. His hands, accustomed to the delicate work of crafting churchware, shaped the vessels smoothly and neatly. Dan put him in charge of pottery production, and the priest flourished. For the first time since landing on the island, he stopped looking like a man awaiting death. The third problem was lighting, not for homes, but for work. Distillation continued through the night, but kerosene lamps in open clay bowls provided little light and posed a fire hazard near the oil. Dan designed a sealed lamp. A metal casing made of flattened tin. A glass bulb. There was no glass, so he replaced it with thin mica he found in the rocks on the northern cliff. A wick made of braided cotton, an adjustment screw for flame height. The lamp burned brightly and evenly. The flame was enclosed. No sparks flew. It could be placed next to the barrels without any fear. He made 10 such lamps. He hung them on posts along the road from the cove to the residential neighborhood. In the evening, when all 10 were lit, the road glowed with a warm, golden light from one end to the other. 36 people stood and watched. None of them had ever seen a lit street.
Even in the capital, streetlights were found only in the three main squares, where they burned dimly and smelly with whale blubber.
Here, on this cursed island at the edge of the world, 10 clear, even lights were burning, and the road between them was smooth and black as a mirror.
Hank stood there in silence. Then he said quietly that it was beautiful. Dan nodded. He thought so too. A week after the lanterns were installed, Johanna arrived with her next shipment. She was carrying copper and tools ordered by Mire, and she brought 23 people. Runaway serfs, discharged sailors, 2 families with children. A little girl of about 5 held her mother's hand and stared at the lanterns with her mouth agape. Dan looked at her and thought about the 4th law. Children don't work. Children study. Leonard, it's time to prepare the program. Crescendo's population has reached 59 people. Dan stood on the road between the streetlights and looked at his people. Workers, builders, the potter priest, the accountant, a merchant's daughter, the spy, the head of security, the fisherman, the distillation operator, the former soldier who might be an enemy agent, and the children. There were children on this cursed island. That meant Crescendo was no longer a penal colony. It was a settlement. And a settlement needed to take the next step. It took Dan 3 weeks to build the distillation column. The copper sheet that Johanna brought was thin and soft, ideal for boilers but too pliable for a vertical structure. Dan solved this problem with a frame. Iron rods standing vertically with copper sheets wrapped around them. The seams were soldered with tin. There are 4 trays inside. Each tray is a copper disc with holes through which steam rises. On each tray, the steam partially condenses and the liquid flows downward. The lightest attractions reach the top. The heaviest remain at the bottom. At the outlet of each plate, a discharge tube leads to its own receiver. 4 plates, 4 products. Gasoline, kerosene, fuel oil, bitumen. 1 batch and everything at once. Dan worked alone and taught Hank and Tom. He checked every seam personally. He measured every hole in the tray with a stick marked with notches. He had only one precise tool, a ruler he'd made from a straight strip of wood, marking it to the length of his own palm. The palm of Daniel Crow's former body measured 19 centimeters from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger. Dan had measured this during his first week on the island and had used it as a standard ever since. Not perfect, but good enough for a 4-plate copper still.
The column stood on a platform next to the cove, 3 meters tall, slightly crooked, with green streaks of tin running down the seams. Ugly by the standards of any 21st century oil refinery. But it was a distillation column. A real, working distillation column in a world where people still burned candles made of lard. The launch was scheduled for the morning. Dan hadn't slept all night. He sat by the column, checking every component. The feed line, the furnace, the offtakes, the receivers, the coolers. Mia sat next to him, preparing a chart to record the results. Hank was dozing by the furnace, clutching the axe the way a child clutches a toy. In the morning, everyone gathered. 59 people stood in a semicircle, gazing at the copper tower glinting in the dawn light. Dan loaded 50 liters of crude oil into the boiler. He lit the furnace. The oil roared beneath the boiler. The temperature began to rise. Dan stood by the column and listened. The metal crackled as it heated up. Steam hissed through the pipes. The first drops of condensate fell into the upper receiver 20 minutes later. Clear, almost invisible. Gasoline. Dan sniffed it. Pure, light, explosive. He switched the flow to the second receiver. 10 minutes later, kerosene began to flow, golden and oily with that scent Dan knew better than any perfume. He held his finger under the stream. Warm, pure, free of sulfur impurities.
Mia stood with a notepad recording every minute: volume, color, smell, time. The third receiver took in fuel oil: dark, heavy, thick, fuel for furnaces and boilers, the stuff he'd use to build a steam engine in a year. The fourth receiver: bitumen, black as night, hot and malleable, roads, roofs, waterproofing. The distillation lasted 4 hours. From 50 litres of crude oil, Dan obtained 7 litres of gasoline, 18 litres of kerosene, 12 litres of fuel oil, and about 10 litres of bitumen. The kerosene yield was 36%, 6% higher than in the copper still. Losses were minimal. The seams held, the tanks were working, the distillation column was working. Dan stood in front of it and watched in silence. Hank walked over and slapped him on the back so hard that Dan nearly fell over. Hank said he didn't understand half of what Dan was doing, but that this thing was beautiful. Dan agreed. It really was beautiful. The column's capacity allowed for 3 distillations a day, 44 litres of kerosene per day.
Almost 400 per week, 10 barrels, 40 barrels a month.
That was 10 times more than before. Mira calculated the profits in a single evening. At a price of 12 silver coins per barrel, 40 barrels a month would amount to 480 silver coins, plus fuel oil, plus bitumen, plus gasoline, which could also be sold if they found a buyer who wouldn't set themselves on fire. Resender's total monthly income could amount to 600 silver coins a month. By comparison, the annual income of an average imperial estate was about 1,000. Crescend earned in a month more than half of the empire's noble families earned in a year. Mire spoke the figure quietly and evenly, but Dan saw her hand holding the coal tremble slightly. She understood what that meant, and so did he. That kind of money attracts attention. That kind of money attracts enemies. Dan spoke with Marcus. He said the island needed defenses. Not an army, but at least a wall around the bay and a lookout post on the northern cliff. Marcus nodded. He didn't ask why. A former soldier understood without explanation. He began building the wall. Not very high, about a man's height, made of stone and bituminous mortar, with loopholes every 10 paces. Not a fortress, but a position from which 10 men could stop 50 on the open shore. At the same time, Dan set about doing what he'd been thinking about for a long time. Weapons. Not swords or muskets, chemical defensive weapons. Gasoline. 7 litres from each distillation. Volatile, highly flammable, and completely useless as a commodity. But as a weapon. Dan recalled the story of Greek fire, a mixture that burns on water and is impossible to extinguish. He didn't know the exact recipe for Greek fire, no one did. But he knew something even better. He knew petrochemistry. Gasoline plus a thickener made from bitumen. Napalm. The simplest napalm made from 2 factors he had in abundance. Thickened gasoline burns longer. It sticks to surfaces. It burns on water. It doesn't go out when doused with water. Dan made a test batch. He mixed gasoline with finely chopped bitumen. He stirred it until he got a thick, sticky mass. He poured a spoonful onto a rock and set it on fire. It burned fiercely. A fierce yellow-orange flame, thick black smoke. The rock beneath it turned red-hot. Dan splashed seawater onto the burning mixture. The flame flared up even more intensely. The water didn't put it out. It only scattered the burning mixture further. Dan stood there watching the fire.
He didn't want to make weapons. He wanted to make lamps and roads and steam engines. But lamps and roads and engines wouldn't save them from 20 ships full of soldiers. Napalm would. He made 20 clay pots filled with concentrated gasoline.
He covered them with oil-soaked rags. He stored them separately in a stone cellar far from the house. He showed Marcus how to throw them. Set the rag on fire, throw the pot, and don't stand nearby. Marcus took a pot in his hand and weighed it. Then he looked at Dan and said it was a terrible thing. Dan replied that it was. Marcus asked who it was meant for. Dan said it was meant for those who would come to take what they had built. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he said that if such people came, he'd be on the wall, not behind it, on it. Dan looked at him and, for the first time, thought that maybe Clara was wrong. Maybe Marcus wasn't a spy. Maybe he was just a soldier who was tired of following bad orders and wanted to follow good ones. Or maybe not. Dan couldn't take the risk. He nodded and walked away. The next day, something happened that he hadn't expected. At dawn, a small fishing boat pulled up to the cove. A girl was sitting in it. A red-headed, freckled girl with calloused hands and eyes full of stubbornness. She jumped onto the dock and shouted across the entire shore. She was shouting a name. Hank. She was looking for her grandfather. Hash dropped his bowl of porridge and ran toward the dock. He ran as he had never run before in all his time on the island, gasping for breath with every labored breath. The girl saw him and rushed toward him. They collided in the middle of the dock and hugged each other so tightly that Dan thought one of them was about to break the other's ribs. Hank held her by the shoulders and stared. Then he turned away and covered his face with his hand. His shoulders were shaking. The girl was crying too, but with angry, defiant tears. She said she'd been told he was dead, that all the exiles were dead, that no one survives on Crescendo. But she didn't believe it. She'd stolen a boat from a neighbor and rowed for 2 days, alone, across the sea. She was 19 years old. Her name was Abigail Finch. Abby, Hank's granddaughter. Red-haired as a dandelion, with a freckled nose and palms that smelled of tar and iron. Hank brought her to the camp and sat her down by the fire. She ate greedily and quickly. Between bites, she looked around. Dan saw how her eyes moved.
She wasn't just looking, she was studying. She spent the longest time examining the distillation column. Then she turned to Hank and asked what that thing did. Hank began to explain. He stumbled over his words. He talked about steam and tubes and oil. Abby listened with a frown. Then she stood up, walked over to the column and circled it. She ran her hand along the seams. She tapped on the wall. She peered into the furnace. Then she came back and said that the seam on the 3rd section was weak and would start leaking soon. Dan walked over to the 3rd section. He ran his finger along the seam. The tin was thinner than on the other sections. He'd soldered it last when he was already tired and in a hurry. Abby was right. In a week at most, that seam would start leaking. Hot steam under pressure. Burns. Maybe an explosion. Dan turned to her and asked how she knew about the seams. Abby said she'd been repairing fishing boats at the docks since she was 12. She'd soldered copper kettles. She'd worked on locks and hinges. Her father used to say it wasn't a woman's job, and once he burned her first homemade loom, which she'd put together from scraps of wood and twine. A small loom. It worked crookedly, but it worked. Her father burned it in the yard and said a girl should spin with her hands, not come up with devilish contraptions. Abby fell silent. She looked at her hands, then at Dan. Dan was silent for a second. Then he said he needed a mechanic, someone who understands how things work, who can take them apart and put them back together, fix them, improve them. He asked if she wanted to try. Abby looked at him as if she couldn't believe the question was real. Then she nodded, quickly, just once, as if she were afraid he'd change his mind. Dan led her to the hand pump, which creaked and sputtered oil every 5th stroke.
He said the pump worked, but not well. Take it apart and fix it. The tools are over there. Abby crouched down in front of the pump. She looked at it for a minute. Then she started taking it apart. Her hands moved confidently and precisely. She removed the lever, pulled out the piston, examined the leather seal, ran her finger along the inside wall of the cylinder. Then she put it back together. The whole process took 20 minutes. She stood up and said the problem was with the piston. The leather is dry and doesn't seal tightly against the walls. Oil is seeping back through the gap.
If you soak the leather in fuel oil, it will swell and fit more tightly. Also, the lever is too long. Because of this, the piston stroke is too long, and on the return stroke it sucks in air. Shorten the lever by a third, and the pump will stop sputtering. Dan listened and nodded silently. She was absolutely right, on both points. He had seen these problems himself, but hadn't had time to fix them. She spotted them in 20 minutes. The next day, Dan hung a sign on the workshop door. He'd carved it with a knife on a piece of wood. Chief Mechanic E. Finch. Abby stood in front of the sign and read it. She read it again, and once more. Then she turned away and walked around the corner. Hank found her there half an hour later. She was sitting on a rock, crying silently with her hand pressed against her mouth. Hank sat down beside her and hugged her. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. From that day on, Abby became part of Crescendo. Not a guest, not Hank's granddaughter. Part of the machinery. She fixed the pump in a day. Then she fixed the second pump, which Marcus had built based on the first one. Then she suggested changing the design of the third one, removing the leather piston and replacing it with a wooden one with toe soaked in fuel oil. Cheaper, simpler, and more durable. Dan approved. The third pump ran without a single glitch. The fourth month on the island. A population of 72 people. 4 children. 2 streets. 10 houses. 28 streetlights. A distillation column. 3 pumps. A pottery workshop. A sewing workshop. A kitchen. A warehouse. A pier. A wall around the bay. An observation post on the northern cliff. A school. Yes, a school. Leonard began teaching 4 children and 3 adults who couldn't read. He taught them on rocks with a piece of charcoal because there was no paper or chalk. But he taught them. 2 hours every day. Letters, numbers, names, their own names. A 5-year-old child wrote his name for the first time in his life and showed it to his mother. His mother began to cry. Leonard stood nearby, blushing with embarrassment and as happy as he had been on the day he was given his first doublet at court. Only this moment was real. That doublet was gone. Dan saw all of this and kept working. He had no time to stop. Time was working against him. Marcus's letter had been sent 2 months ago. If Clara was right and Marcus had indeed written to the Duke, then Morvain already knew. He was already thinking. He was already planning. Dan didn't know exactly what Marcus had written.
Clara had intercepted the second letter a month after the first and read it without breaking the seal. It was dry and brief. The exiles are alive. They're producing fuel oil from the Black Earth. A former treasury advisor is in charge. The population is growing. Not a word about the convoy. Not a word about the defensive fortifications. Not a word about napalm. Marcus was reporting facts, but not all the facts. Dan couldn't figure out why. If Marcus is a spy, he should report everything. If he isn't a spy, he shouldn't be writing at all. But he's writing, just not everything. Clara said this could mean 2 things. Either Marcus is playing his own game, or he doesn't even know whose side he's on. Dan accepted this as a working hypothesis and went back to work. He couldn't afford the luxury of figuring out Marcus right now. Too much on his plate. Johanna arrived on the next flight and brought news that made Dan freeze. People in the capital were talking about crescendo, not in whispers, out loud, in the marketplaces, in the taverns, in the port offices. Crescendo fuel oil, black gold from the cursed island. One of the merchants let it slip, or someone deliberately started the rumor. Johanna said that in the port city of Bridgewater, she'd seen a shop with a sign that read, Crescent lamp oil. Better than whale oil, cheaper than candles. This meant that kerosene had made its way out of the smuggling channels and onto the open market. This meant money, a lot of money, and it meant that hiding was no longer an option. The Church of the Bright Sun had issued an edict, an official document signed by the Archbishop. The black oil known as crescent oil is hereby declared an impure potion. Its sale is prohibited throughout all parishes of the empire. Anyone who trades in it is subject to excommunication from the church. Anyone who uses it commits a sin. Dan listened to this and exhaled quietly. The church had struck the first blow. Not a military one, not an economic one, an ideological one. The most dangerous kind. Because soldiers can be defeated in battle. Merchants can be bribed. But faith can only be overcome by time, or by another faith. He looked at the lanterns burning along the road. Pure light, steady, warm, and indisputable. If this is a sin, then it is a sin that people choose for themselves. Because living in darkness is more terrifying than living in sin. He knew that. The church doesn't yet, but it will find out.
The church's edict dealt a blow to trade. Not immediately, not completely, but noticeably. The Turner brothers arrived a week after the edict and said that in Olmer, 3 shops that sold kerosene had closed. The owners were afraid of excommunication. At the market in Bridgewater, a kerosene merchant was pelted with stones by parishioners of the local church. The barrels were smashed. The oil spilled onto the pavement. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Johanna confirmed it. In the southern ports, kerosene was still being bought. There, the church's influence is weaker, and the Sultanate of Qadir worships different gods altogether and couldn't care less about the edicts of the Bright Sun. But in the central provinces of the empire, the market was shrinking. Mira recalculated the forecast. Revenue had fallen by 30% in a single month. If the trend continued, in 6 months they would lose half their revenue. Dan sat poring over her figures and thought. The church exerted pressure through fear. People weren't afraid of kerosene, they were afraid of excommunication. Excommunication meant you wouldn't be buried according to the rites. It meant your children couldn't be baptized. It meant your neighbors would stop talking to you. For a peasant or a shopkeeper, that was worse than death. You couldn't hit them over the head with it. Arguing with the church was useless. Challenging the edict was foolish. Another way was needed. Dan found it 3 days later. He didn't go to war with the church. He went around it. Bitumen, fuel oil, lubricants, paraffin, byproducts of distillation that the church edict didn't mention. The edict banned black oil known as kresensky, that is, kerosene. But bitumen for roads is not lamp oil. Fuel oil for furnaces is not a potion for lamps. Lubricant for mill gears is not a devilish liquid. Paraffin candles are candles, and candles are a symbol of prayer, and the church cannot ban candles. Dan gathered Mira and Johanna. He explained the strategy. Kerosene is headed for the southern markets where the church has no authority, the Sultanate of Qadir, the free cities along the coast, and the pirate ports. There is demand there, and it will continue to grow. Bitumen, fuel oil, lubricants, and paraffin are headed for the imperial market. None of these terms are mentioned in the edict.
Merchants aren't selling crescent oil. They're selling crescent road paving stone, crescent furnace mix, crescent machine lubricant, and crescent candles. Mire listened and took notes. Then she looked up and said that this would double the workload in the accounting department.
Each product would have to be accounted for separately. Each market would require its own pricing policy. Each merchant would receive their own contract. Dan said that was exactly why he needed a commercial director. He offered her the position. Mire remained silent. Then she quietly asked if her signature would appear on the contracts. Dan said it would, first on the list. Mire nodded. She didn't smile. But that night she worked until dawn, and by morning she had laid out a complete 6-month business plan in front of Dan. Revenue, expenses, products, markets, prices, margins, for stones, for coal. Flawless. The strategy worked. 2 months later, Crescendo was selling bitumen to 4 ports across the empire. The city's road authorities were buying it up eagerly. The empire's roads were a nightmare. Knee-deep mud in the spring, knee-deep dust in the summer. Bitumen solved both problems. One city administrator in Olmer ordered 20 barrels of bitumen to repair the main street. When the street was paved and dried, the townspeople walked along it in disbelief. A smooth, even black surface you could walk on after rain without getting your shoes wet. The administrator ordered another 40 barrels. The fuel oil went to the blacksmith shops and foundries. The blacksmiths appreciated it right away. It burns hotter than coal. It's cheaper than coal. No need to lug heavy sacks. Just pour it from the barrel and get to work. A blacksmith from the town of Havenport wrote to Johanna that since switching to Crescent fuel oil, his workshop's productivity had doubled. He requested a steady supply. Millers and weavers also bought the lubricant. Wooden gears and shafts that used to creak and break now ran quietly and smoothly. One mill in the province of Dornmark increased its milling output by 1/3 simply because the gears stopped seizing up. Paraffin candles became a big hit. Dan taught Greta and Lynn how to make paraffin candles. Pure white and odorless. They burn evenly. They don't smoke. They don't drip like tallow candles. They cost less than wax candles. The church couldn't ban them. That would have been absurd.
And when the first batch of Crescent paraffin candles appeared in the shop next to the Olmer Cathedral, the irony was so obvious that even the local priest bought 3 of them. Kiren's income recovered. Then it grew. By the 5th month, total revenue on the island stood at 800 silver coins per month, more than before the edict. Mire reported this to Dan with an expression that was almost a smile. Almost. But alongside the trade war, another threat was growing. Clara intercepted Marcus's 3rd letter. It contained more details than the previous ones. Population figures, number of houses, production volume, but still not a word about defensive fortifications. And one phrase at the end that made Dan reread it 3 times. Marcus wrote that Advisor Crow was not who he seemed to be, that he knew things that no one else in the Empire could possibly know, and that the Duke should think not of destruction, but of control. Marcus suggested that the Duke not burn Crescendo, but capture it. Take Dan. Take his knowledge. Use it. Dan stood on the shore and watched the sunset. He thought of Marcus, who was writing to the Duke but not telling him everything, who was suggesting capture, not destruction, who was hiding the walls and the napalm. Marcus was playing his game, and in this game Dan was a pawn, not a player. For now. Dan clenched his teeth. He turned and walked toward the workshop. He needed a steam engine. He needed a ship that sailed without sails. He needed power that couldn't be taken away or stolen because it wasn't in a recipe but in the system, in people, in the knowledge he imparts every day to dozens of hands and minds. He walked into the workshop. Abby was sitting at the workbench, polishing a copper valve by lamplight. Dan sat down next to her and began to sketch. A cylinder, a piston, a connecting rod, flywheel, boiler, fuel oil furnace, steam engine. It took 2 months to build the steam engine.
Abby worked on it 14 hours a day. Dan drew the schematics. Abby turned them into metal. The cylinder was cast from bronze. The bronze was made by alloying copper with tin in a ratio that Dan knew by heart: 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. They melted it in a clay crucible over a fuel oil fire. Abby carved the mold for the cylinder out of stone. The precision was rough. The walls were uneven, but she sanded the inner surface with sand for 3 days until the piston moved smoothly. The piston was made of iron. The seal was oiled tow.
The connecting rod was made from an oak beam reinforced with iron strips. The flywheel was a cast iron rim from a wheel that Johanna had brought from an old mill. The boiler was copper, that very first boiler that started it all. Dan had rebuilt it. He reinforced the walls with a second layer of copper. He soldered all the weak seams. He added a safety valve, a simple spring-loaded valve that releases steam if the pressure rises too high. Without this valve, the boiler would burst at the first sign of serious overheating. Dan remembered the history of steam boilers on Earth. Hundreds had died in explosions. He had no intention of repeating those mistakes. The furnace was designed for fuel oil. The nozzle was made of a copper tube with a control valve. The fuel oil was fed by gravity from a tank above. It burned evenly and hot. No firewood, no coal. A pure fuel oil fire. The test was conducted at dawn on the 7th month. The engine stood on a stone platform next to the workshop. Abby poured water into the boiler. Dan opened the fuel oil valve and lit the nozzle. The fire roared beneath the boiler. The water began to heat up. Everyone waited. 100 people. Over the past few months, Crescendo's population had surpassed 100. The people stood in a semicircle, watching the copper machine as it puffed and crackled. Steam began to escape after 20 minutes. The pressure rose. Dan kept an eye on a primitive pressure gauge he'd made from a bent copper tube filled with water. When the pressure reached the desired level, he opened the steam valve. Steam surged into the cylinder. The piston jerked. The connecting rod swayed. The flywheel turned a quarter turn. Then it stopped. Dan closed the valve. He checked all the connections. He found the problem. The piston was too tight. There was too much friction. The pressure wasn't enough to push it through its full stroke. Abby removed the cylinder in an hour. She ground the inner wall for another 2 hours. She put it back together. Second attempt. Steam into the cylinder. The piston moved. The connecting rod moved. The flywheel turned. 1 revolution, 2, 3, 5, 10. The flywheel was picking up speed. 20 revolutions per minute, 30. Slowly, laboriously, but unstoppably. The flywheel was spinning. The steam engine was running. Dan stood there watching the spinning flywheel. The sound wasn't pretty. The slurping of the piston, the creaking of the connecting rod, the hissing of the steam. But it was the sound of the future. The sound of power that didn't depend on wind or currents. The sound of a world that would never be the same again. Hank looked at the flywheel and said nothing. Then he quietly remarked that this thing was spinning on its own. Dan said it was. Hank asked if they could attach a saw to it. Dan smiled and said that was exactly what he was planning to do. The first use of the steam engine was a sawmill, not a ship. A sawmill, because the Crescendo needed planks. Lots of planks. For houses, for furniture, for docks, for barrels. The trees on the island grew thin and crooked, but Johanna brought logs from the mainland, and they had to be cut. Cutting them by hand with a 2-handed saw was back-breaking work. 4 men could cut 2 logs in a day. A steam-powered sawmill could cut the same amount in an hour. Dan set up the engine next to the lumberyard. He connected the saw via a flywheel and a system of belts. Ron stood at the feed and guided the log. The engine roared and cut. The boards came out straight and uniform. On the first day, the sawmill produced as many boards as 4 men would have made in a week.
The residents of Crescendo watched this and began to understand. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't magic. It was power. Real mechanical power that did the work for people. Dan took the next step 3 weeks later. A second steam engine. More precisely, the same engine but modified for a different task. A ship. Johanna brought in an old sloop she'd bought for a song in Havenport. The bottom was rotten, and the sails were torn and full of holes. To an ordinary captain, it was junk. To Dan, it was a hull. He gutted the sloop. He removed the mast. He removed the sails. He reinforced the bottom with sheets of copper coated with bitumen. He placed a boiler and an engine in the center of the hull. At the stern, he installed a propeller shaft with a primitive propeller. Abby cast the propeller from bronze based on a drawing Dan had sketched from memory. It wasn't perfect. 3 blades, roughly machined, but they were symmetrical. The launch took place without any ceremonial speeches. Dan stood on deck next to the boiler. Abby stood by the engine. Hank stood at the helm. Johanna stood on the dock smoking a pipe with an expression that said she didn't believe a single word but really wanted to be proven wrong. Dan nodded to Abby. She opened the steam valve. The engine gurgled, the shaft turned, the propeller struck the water, the sloop jerked forward, once more, again, and off it went. Slowly, laboriously, listing to starboard, at a speed a pedestrian could easily outpace. But it was moving, without sails, without oars.
Against the wind, against the current. The sloop left the cove and headed north. The wind blew in its face. Waves crashed against the bow. The sloop moved forward. 3 knots, a pitiful 3 knots. Any sailing fishing boat would have outpaced it by a factor of 2, but no fishing boat could sail directly against the wind without making a single tack. And this sloop could. Johanna stood on the pier and watched. The pipe went out in her hand. She didn't notice. She was looking at the sailless ship heading into the wind, and in her eyes was something Dan rarely saw. Understanding. Not surprise. Understanding. She understood that the world had just changed. Forever. The sloop returned to the cove an hour later. Dan stepped ashore, wet from spray and steam. Abby hopped down after him, covered in oil and soot with a smile from ear to ear. Hank was the last to disembark and said that the steering was a piece of junk and that he'd nearly run them aground on the rocks twice. But there was no anger, only excitement. Dan named the sloop First Fire. Not the prettiest name, but an accurate one. News of the ship without sails spread along the coast within a month. Johanna told the story in 2 ports. The Turner brothers told the story in 4. Sailors retold it to one another in taverns, and with each retelling the story grew richer in detail. The ship flies across the water faster than the wind. The ship spews fire and smoke. A sorcerer lives on Crescendo who has enslaved the sea. Dan listened to Johanna's accounts and shook his head. The rumors were both good and bad. Good because new people were flocking to the island, sailors who wanted to see it with their own eyes, craftsmen who wanted to work, and families fleeing their landlords and a new life. By the 8th month, Crescendo's population had surpassed 200. 4 streets, 30 houses, a hospital, a school for 20 students, a market, a tavern opened by Phil, a former thief using only one hand because the other had never fully healed from a burn. The bad news was that the rumors had reached the capital, and not just the capital, to Duke Morvain, to the church, to Emperor Aurelian III. Clara intercepted Marcus's 4th letter. It was longer than the previous ones. Marcus described the steamboat in detail, how it worked, its speed, its limitations. He described the convoy. He described the supplies. He described the defenses.
For the first time, he wrote about the wall and the observation post.
For the first time, he wrote about incendiary mixtures. And at the end of the letter was a sentence that changed everything. Marcus wrote that if the Duke was planning a military expedition, it would have to consist of at least 20 ships, because Crescent was capable of defending itself. Dan read the letter by lamplight and felt a chill run down his spine. Marcus had just informed the Duke that Crescent could be taken. He named the price: 20 ships. This wasn't advice on defense. It was an invitation to attack, complete with instructions. Dan called Clara. He said they couldn't wait any longer. She nodded. They spoke with Marcus that same evening. Dan didn't beat around the bush. He laid copies of all 4 intercepted letters in front of Marcus. Clara stood behind him. Marcus looked at the letters. His expression didn't change. Then he looked up and said he'd been waiting for this conversation. He said yes. He was a former officer in Duke Morvain's personal guard. He'd been sent to Crescent to make sure the exiles were dead. When it turned out that the exiles were alive, he received orders to observe and report. He reported. Because the Duke's sister was in the capital. His younger sister, 14 years old. If Marcus stopped writing, the Duke would assume he was dead or had betrayed him, and then his sister would pay the price for him. Dan was silent. Clara was silent. Marcus continued speaking. He said he didn't want Crescent to burn. He said he had built more here than in 10 years of service to Morvain. He said that if he could, he would stop writing. But he couldn't. Not while his sister was in the capital. Dan thought for a moment. Then he asked Marcus why he had written about 20 ships. Marcus looked him in the eye and said it was because Morvain didn't have 20 ships. Not out of his own pocket. To assemble 20 ships, he'd have to go through the naval command, which meant going through the Emperor. And the Emperor meant publicity. A scandal. Questions. Why would a duke want to attack his own territory? What's so special about Crescendo? Marcus wasn't giving Morvain instructions. He was setting a trap for him, forcing him to act publicly, through the system, where he could be stopped. Dan looked at Marcus and saw a man who had been living a double life for 9 months, building walls by day, writing denunciations by night, weighing every word, hiding the truth within the truth. He wasn't a spy. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, trying to save both. Dan held out his hand. Marcus looked at it. Then he shook it, firmly, briefly.
Clara stood nearby and watched. Her face wore an expression Dan couldn't read. Maybe respect. Maybe disappointment that her story turned out to be more complicated than simple betrayal. Dan told Marcus that together they would get his sister out of the capital. Not now, but when the time came. Marcus nodded and left. Time was running out. Dan could feel it. Morvain would receive the letter. Morvain would go to the naval command. The fleet would begin preparing an expedition. How long would that take? 2 months? Maybe 3. Dan began to prepare. 5 steamships. He needed 5 steamships by the time the Imperial fleet appeared on the horizon. The first vessel had already set sail. Abby had fine-tuned the engine. The speed had increased from 3 to 5 knots. Not much, but for a ship without sails it was enough. The second steamship was built from a rowboat purchased from fishermen. The third from an old coastal freighter that Johanna found in the port of Bridgewater. The fourth and fifth from 2 sloops brought in by free sailors lured by rumors of the Crescent miracle. These were produced on an assembly line. Abby trained 4 apprentices. Each worked on a specific part. One cast the cylinders, another ground the pistons, a third bent the tubes, the fourth assembled the parts. Abby inspected and fine-tuned them. Dan designed and calculated. At the same time, he was working on weapons. Not napalm, something more serious. High-explosive shells. The principle was simple. A cast iron shell, gunpowder inside, and a fuse. Upon impact, the shell would shatter, and the fragments would fly in all directions. Gunpowder. Dan could make gunpowder. Not perfect, but it worked. Saltpeter, charcoal, sulfur. He obtained the saltpeter from manure that had accumulated from the goats and pigs brought in over the past few months. It was a long and smelly process. Compost pits filled with manure and ash. After 3 months, leaching, evaporation, saltpeter crystals, charcoal made from wood, sulfur from oil. Dan knew how to extract sulfur from heavy oil fractions with a high hydrogen sulfide content. The process was dangerous and toxic, but it was doable. By the 10th month on the island, he had 20 pounds of gunpowder. Not much, but enough for 50 explosive shells. Abby cast the shells from cast iron, hollow spheres the size of a fist, with thick walls and a hole for the fuse, ugly and rough.
But during a test, a single such ball blew a wooden shield to smithereens from a distance of 30 paces.
Hank stood nearby during the test and turned pale. He said it was worse than a cannon. Dan replied that it was a cannon, just a small, handheld one. Winter of the first year, the anniversary of the landing. Dan stood at the lookout post on the northern cliff and looked out over his island. 400 people, 6 streets, a harbour with 5 docks, a distillation column, 3 distillation units, a sawmill, a blacksmith's shop, a foundry, a pottery workshop, a sewing workshop, a school, a hospital, a tavern, a market, 5 steamships in the bay, a wall surrounding the harbour, 40 streetlights glowing along the roads. 400 people whom the world had written off as worthless. Thieves, deserters, fugitives, the impoverished, the condemned, the forgotten. They built a city, from scratch, on a cursed island, out of black mud and sheer stubbornness. Dan looked at it all and thought it had been worth dying for on that road in Houston. Then he shook off the thought and headed downstairs. A storm was coming from the west, and with a storm, anything could come. An imperial fleet appeared on the horizon in the middle of winter. 22 ships, line of battle ships with red sails and a golden sun on their mainsails. A lookout on the northern cliff spotted them at dawn and raised a signal flag. Dan was standing on the pier 10 minutes later. A spyglass. 22 sails. They were sailing in even formation downwind from the southwest. They'd picked the right day. A favourable wind. Clear weather. Professional work. Dan lowered his spyglass. Marcus was standing nearby. His face was ashen. He said it was Vice Admiral Corbin's fleet, the Imperial fleet's best tactician, a veteran of the war with the Qadir Sultanate. Morvain didn't just choose 20 ships. He chose the best ones. Dan nodded. He turned to Hank and said 3 words. Raise steam. 5 steamships in the bay sprang to life. Abby ran from one to the next, checking the boilers. Apprentices stoked the furnaces. The fuel oil fire roared beneath the fireboxes. The pressure began to rise. Each steamship had a crew of 10, a helmsman, an engineer, a stoker, 7 fighters with pots of incendiary mixture and explosive shells. Dan didn't go out to sea. His place was on shore, at the observation post, with the signal flag system he had developed himself. 12 combinations.
Each signaled a command: right, left, forward, backward, attack, retreat, change. Boiler overheating, stand down. He had trained the crews for 2 weeks. Every helmsman knew every signal by heart. Dan entrusted command of the steamships to Johanna. She was the only one who knew the sea and ships at a professional level. She stood on the deck of the first fire in a men's shirt, her red hair tied back in a bun, watching the approaching fleet.
Dan saw her through his spyglass. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. That anger had been building for 10 years, ever since the day her father was hanged for transporting medicine. The fleet approached to within 2 miles. Corbin sent a rowboat ahead, carrying a white flag and an officer. The officer stepped ashore and read out the demand. In the name of the Emperor, Crescent Island is territory of the Valestin Empire. All persons on the island are required to submit to imperial jurisdiction. All production facilities are to be transferred to the imperial crown. The individual named Daniel Crow is to be arrested and brought to the capital to stand trial on charges of the illegal production and trafficking of prohibited substances. Resistance will be met with force. Dan stood before the officer and listened. Then he asked if the Emperor's personal signature was on this document. The officer hesitated. The document had been signed by Duke Morvain on behalf of the military council, not by the Emperor. Dan nodded. He told the officer that he would convey his response to Vice Admiral Corbin. Crescent obeys only the Emperor's direct orders. A document signed by Duke Morvain has no legal authority to arrest free citizens. If the Vice Admiral wishes to verify his authority, let him return with the Emperor's personal seal. Until then, Crescent will defend its borders. The officer turned pale. He said it was mutiny. Dan said it was the law. The officer returned to his launch and sailed away. An hour later, the fleet began to reposition. 22 ships formed a battle line and headed for the bay. Dan raised the first signal flag. The steamships left the bay. 5 small, soot-stained vessels without a single sail against 22 magnificent ships of the Imperial fleet. It looked ridiculous. For the first half hour, the steamships did not head toward the line. They fanned out, 1 on each flank, 3 in the center. The Imperial ships sailed downwind in formation. Fast, graceful, deadly, but in formation.
And formation means they're tied to one another. If one turns, they all turn. If one stops, the formation breaks. The steamships weren't tied to each other by anything. Each followed its own course. Each could turn on a dime. Each could sail against the wind. The Imperial ships couldn't. Johanna, on the first fire, approached from the leeward side, where sailing ships cannot turn quickly. She closed to within 100 meters of the outermost ship of the line. The fighters on deck set fire to the pots and hurled them. 6 pots of concentrated gasoline flew onto the deck of the Imperial ship. 4 hit their mark. The napalm flared up. A fierce, unquenchable flame spread across the deck. The sailors rushed to put it out with water. The water was of no help. The fire raged even more fiercely. The ship was ablaze from bow to mainmast within 3 minutes. The first ship turned and fled before the Imperial cannons could take aim. The steamship was sailing against the wind. The sailing ships could not pursue it. A second steamship came in from the right, a third from the left. Shells were flying. 2 ships caught fire at the same time. The Imperial formation began to break down. The ships spread out, trying not to collide with their burning neighbors. The sails hindered maneuvering in such tight quarters. The steamships weaved between them like mice among elephants. Small, nimble, and unaffected by the wind. Dan stood at the observation post and raised the flags. "Second steamship, stand off, you're overheating. Third steamship, replace the second on the left flank. Fifth steamship, advance down the center." He wasn't commanding the attack. He was managing the system, a machine of 5 ships and 50 men that operated as a single mechanism. Because he was an engineer, and that was his strength. The battle lasted 3 hours. By noon, 4 Imperial ships were ablaze. 2 were sinking, 3 were immobilized. The remaining 13 had retreated to a safe distance. Not a single steamer was lost. The second one had been holed by a cannonball, but Abby plugged the hole from the inside with tow and bitumen right in the middle of the battle,
with the ship waist-deep in water. Vice Admiral Corbin sent out a second boat with a white flag, this time without any demands. He asked that the survivors be pulled from the water. Dan agreed. The Crescendo steamships rescued 120 sailors from the water. They were fed, bandaged, and housed in empty homes.
Dan arrived at the capital that evening. A burnt Imperial sailor lay on a cot, staring at the kerosene lamp on the wall. He said quietly that they had come to destroy these lamps, these people, and that these people had saved them. Dan said nothing. He adjusted the bandage on the sailor's arm and left. The next morning, the remnants of the Imperial fleet weighed anchor and sailed east. 8 ships out of 22. Dan stood on the pier and watched as the red sails faded beyond the horizon. Johanna stood beside him. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline that had finally subsided. She turned to Dan and said they had won. Dan shook his head. He said it wasn't a victory. It was a pause. Now the Emperor would definitely find out, and his reaction would decide everything. 3 weeks passed in silence after the battle. Not a single ship on the horizon, neither merchant nor military. Crescent held its breath in anticipation. Dan made the most of every day, repairing the steamships, restocking ammunition supplies, repairing the wall that had been hit by 2 cannonballs. Construction never stopped. The 6th distillation unit, a second steam engine for the workshops, a new dock. Mira counted the supplies and said they had enough food to last 2 months on their own without a resupply. Dan nodded and continued working. On the 22nd day, a ship arrived. Just one, not a military vessel. A mail brig flying a white flag with the Imperial standard on its mast. Dan went down to the pier. An officer in full-dress uniform disembarked from the ship. He was carrying a sealed package. He handed it to Dan, bowed, and returned to the ship. He didn't say a word. Dan broke the seal. The seal was personal. A golden sun with the letter A in the center. Aurelian III, Emperor. The letter was short. Dan read it once. He read it a second time. Then he folded it and tucked it into his shirt front. He stood on the pier for a minute. People were gathering around him. Hank, Abby, Marcus, Clara, Mira, Johanna, Father Quentin, Leonard, Ron, Phil, and Mark. Everyone who had been with him from day one, and everyone who had joined later. 400 people who had built this city from nothing. Dan looked at them and said that the Emperor was inviting him to the capital, not as a criminal, not as a rebel, but as an equal. Silence. Then Hank asked if it was a trap. Clara said it might be. Dan said it might be. But he'd go. Not because he trusted the Emperor, But because if he didn't go, next spring there wouldn't be 20 ships. There'd be 50. And no steamships would help. We need peace. Real peace. With a treaty, seals, and guarantees. Johanna said she'd go with him. Her ship, her crew. She'd take him to the capital and bring him back, alive. Dan shook his head. He said he'd go on a steamship, on the first fire, without sails, straight to the capital's port. Let them see, let everyone see what's arrived. Mire said she's going too. She needs to be at the negotiations. Contracts, prices, terms. Without her, Dan would sell himself short. Dan looked at her and realized there was no point in arguing. Clara said that if Dan went to the capital without her, he was an idiot. The capital wasn't Crescendo Bay. Different rules applied there. There, people were killed not by shells, but by smiles. Dan agreed. They set out 3 days later. The first leg of the journey took them southeast toward the capital's port of Aurelia. It was a 2-day journey. Dan stood on the deck and looked out at the sea.
Mire stood nearby, silently sorting through the ledgers she'd brought with her. 3 years of Crescendo's accounting. Every single figure, every transaction, every gram of kerosene. Clara stood at the rail, watching the horizon. Johanna was at the helm. Abby sat by the engine, listening to every sound. Marcus stood at the bow. He was travelling with his sister. On the second morning, the spires of Aurelia appeared on the horizon. The capital of the Valestin Empire, a city of 1 million people. White walls, golden domes, red roofs, a harbour crammed with hundreds of ships. The first fire entered the harbour without sails, its smokestack belching smoke, its engine chugging. A small, black, soot-stained vessel amid the snow-white sailboats. Dock workers stopped what they were doing and watched. Sailors leaned over the sides. Boys ran along the docks. A ship without sails. It was moving under its own power. Dan stood on the deck and looked at the city where the man whose body he was carrying had been sentenced to death. They moored at the far pier. They were expected. An imperial escort. 20 guardsmen in full-dress uniforms. A carriage bearing the coat of arms. And a young man of about 25 in a plain dark doublet without any adornments. He stood slightly apart from the guardsmen and looked at the steamship with an expression Dan recognized. Hunger. Not physical, intellectual. A thirst to understand.
The young man was the emperor.
Dan stepped ashore. He bowed, not obsequiously, just as much as one respected person bows to another. Aurelian III stepped forward and extended his hand. A handshake. Not a gesture of etiquette, a personal one. The emperor spoke quietly so that only Dan and Mira, standing nearby, could hear him. He said he wanted to understand how a ship without sails worked. Dan replied that he would show him, but first, a conversation. The negotiations lasted 6 days, not with the emperor, with his ministers, with the military council, with the treasury, with the Chamber of Commerce, and with Duke Morvain. Dan saw him for the first time on the 3rd day. A tall, greying man with intelligent eyes and impeccable posture. Morvain entered the conference room and looked at Dan the way one looks at an object that's ended up somewhere it shouldn't be. Not anger, irritation, annoyance. Dan looked back at him and said nothing. This man had sentenced Daniel Crow to death, poisoned him in prison, sent him to die on that cursed island, staged a show trial to eliminate an inconvenient witness. Dan remembered fragments of someone else's memory. Long corridors, fear, the cold eyes of the woman who signed the death warrant. He didn't bring it up. Not now. Mira was leading the negotiations. She laid out 3 years' worth of figures before the ministers. Production volumes, revenues, tax potential. She showed that Crescendo could pay the empire more taxes than 3 average provinces combined, if left alone, if granted autonomy, if allowed to trade freely. The ministers did the math. Morvain frowned. The emperor listened. Clara worked at night. She met with people she knew from her previous life in the secret chancellery. She gathered information. 4 days later, she placed a folder in front of Dan. The folder contained documents. The order to poison Daniel Crow in prison, signed by Morvain. The record of the fabricated charges. The testimony of bribed witnesses. And correspondence with the prison doctor. Everything. A complete set of evidence proving that the Morvain had killed an innocent man and rigged the trial. Dan took the folder. He didn't go to the emperor. He went to Morvain, alone, without security. Morvain received him in his office. They sat across from each other in armchairs. Between them stood a table with a decanter of wine that no one had touched. Dan placed the folder on the table. He opened it. Morvain looked at the documents.
His expression didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. He read everything. Slowly. Then he closed the folder and looked at Dan. He asked what Dan wanted. Dan said he wanted 3 things. First, full autonomy for Crescendo, confirmed by an imperial decree. Second, the repeal of the church edict banning kerosene. Third, Marcus Graves's sister would be released from the Duke's guardianship and move to Crescendo. Morvain looked at him. Then he quietly asked what would happen if he refused. Dan said that in that case, the folder would be on the Emperor's desk tomorrow morning. Morvain was silent for a minute. Then he poured himself some wine. He drank it. He set the glass down. And he said he agreed. On the 6th day, Emperor Aurelian III signed the decree. Crescend Island was declared a free, autonomous region within the Valestin Empire. Self-governance, its own laws, its own trade. The imperial tax was 10% of income. In return, Crescend undertook to supply fuel oil and lubricants to the imperial fleet at a fixed price. Not kerosene, fuel oil, because the Emperor had looked at the steam engine and realized what he had realized. The future belongs to steam, and steam runs on fuel oil. The church edict was revoked a week later, not because Morvain found arguments to convince the archbishop, but because the empress lit a paraffin candle from Crescendo in her chapel and said that light is light, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. The archbishop did not dare to argue with the empress mother. Marcus took his sister away on the day the decree was signed. The girl was 14, thin, frightened, with huge eyes. Marcus held her hand and wouldn't let go. They boarded the first fire together. Marcus stood on the deck and looked at the capital. Then he turned away and never looked back. Dan stood on the pier. He was waiting. He stood there, waiting for the one moment for which he had come to this city. Not for the decree, not for autonomy, for a single glance. She arrived at sunset, a woman with cold, light eyes. The very same woman who had smiled as she signed Daniel Crow's death sentence. Morvain's wife, Lady Victoria. She came to the pier alone, without an entourage, without guards. She stopped 10 paces away from Dan and looked at him. Dan looked at her. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. She was looking at the man she had killed, who stood before her, alive, in a stranger's body, with a stranger's gaze, but alive and victorious. Dan felt no hatred, no anger. He stood there and looked. He just looked, just as he'd wanted. She was the first to lower her eyes. She turned away. She walked off. Dan watched her go. Then he turned and climbed onto the deck of the first fire. He told Johanna that they were leaving. Home. The first fire left the port of Aurelia at sunset. Smoke from the snap rose into the pink sky. The engine chugged steadily and confidently. Everyone was standing on deck. Mire with the recording stones pressed to her chest. Clara at the rail with a calm expression. Marcus with his sister. Johanna at the helm. Abby by the engine. They were heading home, to the cursed island that had ceased to be cursed, to the black shore that had become the foundation of a new world. They were heading home, and behind the stern lay a city that would never be the same again. Because a ship without sails had arrived in that city. And everyone who saw it knew that the wind no longer decides who sails and who stays put. The first fire blazed across the dark sea, smoke billowing from the funnel. Johanna steered it confidently and steadily. Mire was mentally calculating the costs of the return trip. Clara gazed at the stars. Marcus hugged his sister. Abby listened to the engine and smiled because it was running perfectly.
And Dan stood at the bow, looking ahead. He was thinking about the 6-plate distillation column he would build next month, about the second steam engine for the generator, about wires and incandescent bulbs, about electricity, about the telegraph, about the school that would become a university, about the roads that would stretch from coast to coast, about a world in which an orphan from a remote village could read at night by electric light. He thought about how the Industrial Revolution could not be reversed. Knowledge is like fire. Once it burns, it cannot be extinguished. You can stamp out a single lamp, but not 1,000, not 10,000, not 100,000. A small light appeared on the horizon, a small, warm, yellow light. The Crescendo Lighthouse, a kerosene lamp on a cast-iron column that Abby had cast with her own hands. Crescendo's fire. It burned steadily, brightly and unceasingly.